Fear spread like a poison through the countryside. Men, women, and children were affected by strange diseases. Babies were born with deformities. Crops wilted and withered away, and reports of animals behaving strangely littered the land. Shortly after these events began taking place, the fortification was abandoned and left to rot. Almost 400 years later, a Bohemian knight named Heinrich Berke was assigned the role of constructing Houska Castle by Bohemian Duke Primil Ottokar II. Ottokar suggested that any convict willing to be lowered by a rope into the pit and report back what he saw would be granted their freedom. Prisoner after prisoner was lowered into the pit, all shortly filling the seemingly bottomless chasm with their screams of terror before being yanked back to the top. Each of them had succumbed to madness. Despite this terrifying display, one of the last prisoners agreed to be lowered into the pit in exchange for his freedom. Just like the others, the prisoner was lowered into the pit, and eventually his screams emanated up and out of the pit to those standing on the edges. He was immediately pulled back up to the shock of all in attendance. The convict's hair had turned ghost white, and he had aged decades. He was able to mention terrible screams which sounded to come from a great distance below him, and a terrible odor before he began to lose his mind about what he saw and died in madness a few days later.
Let's go!
Welcome back, everybody. Another episode of I Came with Fire podcast. We got Chris back for a short period of time. We decided we're going to do an episode of just the both of us because we know that you guys really love seeing both of our handsome faces together at the same time. I missed you, buddy.
I miss you too. Well, if you're going to look at a horse, you need to see its lips and its anus, because those are how you check whether or not it's actually healthy or not. So it is important to see us. You're the lips, by the way.
Yeah, I was going to say, you've got to be the anus, It's the army aspect that's going on here. But we're going to go back, like you said earlier, to some of the roots of I Came with Fire. If you guys are familiar, we have a lot of new listeners, I just want to say first off, especially over on Rumble. So thank you so much for listening, you guys, especially the Rumble listeners and everybody else. We appreciate you guys all the same. But I got asked the question the other day in the live chat. Somebody was like, what's up with the paranormal stuff that you did recently? It's like, hey, man, you have to go back and look at the entire catalog here. There's a lot of cool stuff that we've been doing for a long time. We've just been in the doghouse, politically speaking, with all of these super left, websites like Instagram and YouTube and all these places. Keep getting dinged for talking about specific things. But anyway, we talk about this stuff all the time. And if you want to listen to a lot of our old stuff, you'll see, obviously, it's not Chris, it's Zach that's there. But really, really good conversations, some pretty cool ones. But we're going to stay in that vein right now on this episode. We're going to talk about a pretty cool place called Houska Castle. But before we do that, I just want to say that a lot of the information about Houska is from local folklore and legend, right? Or the oral tradition, as it were. And, it's speculative. It's enshrouded in mystery. It's the sort of stuff that leaves you wanting more. It's the whole reason why everybody loves the paranormal. Everybody loves, ghost stories, this stuff. It's the unknown is what it is, right? And that's kind of the point of having discussions like these, because you don't know, and it's fun to be speculative, and it's fun to have these conversations where the answers aren't there. And that's why we have these conversations. But, bear that in mind when you listen to some of this stuff, right? It's not all hard facts. There's folk legend and oral tradition. It's easy to cast aside some of this stuff, the oral tradition, but I think it's irresponsible to cast it out or to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. And on that note, we've done our best to find what actual hard facts there are so that we have a real full discussion, so we can keep this conversation as close to the truth as we can, and weaving all of the folklore and the hard facts that we can find. But that's why this conversation is going to be fun. So I just wanted to preface that before we really, really dive right in.
100%. I'm really excited that we're having this conversation for two reasons. Number one, it represents like a palate cleanser. Like you said, we just climbed out of the foxhole of coming through the 2024 election, and it's like the great Ween Moore. I needed a break as much as anybody else did. Is one, and two, you and I have been friends for about 2 years now. And this conversation actually represents the very first time that we ever spoke on the phone. I don't know if you remember, but we, just to let people kind of a little bit behind the curtains of this channel and where we started, we became friends through a mutual contact, Aaron Love from Aaron Loves America.
Oh, yeah.
And
if you've been listening to us, you should know who Aaron is. That's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you guys, I got started listening to you guys doing your paranormal stuff back in the day, what you were doing. And one of the first times that we ever spoke on the phone and just kind of like started talking about things that interested us, mutually. History came up and conspiracy theory and paranormal shit came up. And you actually asked me if I had ever heard about this mystery. I think it was
Castle,
around Christmas time that year, 2022, and we talked about this. And you also introduced me to the conspiracy theories surrounding Stanley Kubrick. And so that launched me off on like a whole, like my wife was so upset.
Hiding Something podcast?
Yeah, because I was in my bed basically for 2 hours every night after we turned everything down, just on my phone, like Googling stuff like, oh my God.
Will you go to bed?
Yeah, exactly. So, but this was one of the very first topics that we ever launched in together.
Yeah.
I think that this story is so interesting because this particular building is 500, almost 550 years older than our very country, and it's still a mystery. Just to set the context of what we're going to talk about, and so that was something that interested me quite a bit. And as you guys are going to see by the time we cover this and we get to the end, there's still a ton that we don't know, and that's pretty cool.
I actually really like that you said that it's 500 years older than our country, because it sort of ties into what I was saying about oral tradition, in that it's such a common thing in this era of history that we're talking about, where there's a reliance on oral tradition. You have to consider that not everybody knew how to write, and not everybody had the capability, meaning the resources to write, and not everybody was writing things down. So there is a heavy element of oral tradition here that was taken with a good dose of credibility back at that time, which is why I say that it is always sort of irresponsible to throw out oral tradition totally and completely as irrelevant or unfactual. Obviously having hard data and all of that is better, but it's true, right? What you just said, it is that old. When oral tradition was a common way to store knowledge, you were storing it in the people that, lived in these areas. And you consider too, with like the way people traveled back then, it was a very big process to go a long distance. And so you could sort of trust the communities in these areas. They stored the history and the lore, and obviously, it's a small town, right? So everybody's got a story about anything. And I'm sure people back in medieval Bohemia were just as much into drama as we are today. You know what I mean? But anyway,
this is the geological nexus of the gypsy. Like where we're going,
totally, yeah.
Right? So it's this is incredible. Yeah, I love it. I love everything about that we're getting ready to talk about tonight. I'm super excited about it. It's really fun stuff. So I guess hope you guys get ready to staple your butt to a chair. Maybe turn the lights down low. Maybe put on a little bit of ambiance in the background, and let's get ready to. I wasn't thinking Kenny G.
Oh, okay. Tubular bells, maybe. That's right. Maybe that's all we need to do at Houska to get everything to calm down. The smooth sounds of Kenny G. All right. Well, let's do it, man. I'm ready. So tonight we're diving into one of the oddest mysteries and downright creepiest bits of folklore that you may have never heard of. We begin this journey in the forests of Bohemia, where the veil between our world and something far more sinister is said to grow dangerously thin. The portal to hell. Quite literally. So open your mind and imagine the 9th century, an age of shifting empires and untamed wilderness. A Sorbian prince named Slavibor chooses this secluded and foreboding place to build a wooden fortification for his son, named Houska. For the fortification, Slavibor chooses a large, oddly shaped slab of limestone, which may have more to do with all of this than you realize right now, but we'll come back to the limestone. Houska was Slavibor's pride and joy, serving his father and his small kingdom with bravery and loyalty. To commemorate his son's actions, Slavibor began building the wooden fort that we mentioned before. According to the legend, shortly after the fortification rose from the rocky earth, the ground itself split open. A gaping chasm that seemed bottomless ominously appeared. As you may think, this was seen as an immediately bad omen, right? Nevertheless, the fortification received its garrison and workers. Shortly thereafter, tragedy began showing its face. Locals whispered that the pit at Houska's fortification was a gateway to hell, spewing forth foul creatures, chimeras, dark spirits, and foul odors. Fear spread like a poison through the countryside. Men, women, and children were affected by strange diseases. Babies were born with deformities. Crops wilted and withered away. And reports of animals behaving strangely littered the land. Shortly after these events began taking place, the fortification was abandoned and left to rot. Almost 400 years later, a Bohemian knight named Heinrich Berke was assigned the role of constructing Houska Castle by Bohemian Duke Primil Ottokar II. Title ownership dates the construction beginning about 1316. This is a long time ago. It is relatively unknown to history the factual why Ottokar began construction of a stone fortification on this site, but we will get into some of the potential reasons pretty soon. Regardless, Ottokar did seek to assuage the fears of the locals and sought to get into the bottom, no pun intended, of what was going on with the chasm at the construction site.
Ew.
A seemingly simple, though daunting task Ottokar developed was seeking volunteers from the local jail. Ottokar suggested that any convict willing to be lowered by a rope into the pit and report back what he saw would be granted their freedom. Several willingly agreed with the idea of their freedom hanging in the air. The day finally came that Ottokar had an envoy.
Hanging in the air.
Right, exactly. Quite literally. The day finally came that Ottokar had an envoy of prisoners and royal guards dispatched at the site for him to oversee. Prisoner after prisoner was lowered into the pit, all shortly filling the seemingly bottomless chasm with their screams of terror before being yanked back to the top. Each of them had succumbed to madness by the time they reached the top, unable to recount what they had seen or experienced. Despite this terrifying display, one of the last prisoners agreed to be lowered into the pit in exchange for his freedom. Just like the others, the prisoner was lowered into the pit, and eventually his screams emanated up and out of the pit to those standing on the edges. He was immediately pulled back up to the shock of all in attendance. The convict's hair had turned ghost white, and he had aged decades. He was able to mention terrible screams which sounded to come from a great distance below him, and a terrible odor before he began to lose his mind about what he saw and died, and it died in madness a few days later. They say that he was taken to what would have been kind of now a psychiatric hospital. I don't know how many psychiatric hospitals they had in 1316, but, nevertheless. The story of in the subsequent completed construction of Houska Castle begs these questions. When Ottokar initially sought to build a fortification here, was his original intent to contain supposed evil within by building an for all intents and purposes, inside-out castle? Or was its intention, as most all other castles, to garrison troops for administrative purposes and for defense of the land? The castle's design may reflect its chilling purpose. As we've said before, its ramparts and walls face inward, directly at the pit, not outward as you would expect a castle to be, as though it is containing some sort of unspeakable force within. As its heart lies a chapel erected directly over the pit, consecrating the ground in a desperate effort to seal what lay beneath. And I'll pull up some of these frescoes later at the chapel. This is a common medieval practice to erect chapels or other Christian iconography over places supposedly marred by evil or dark events. But we must continue to ask, why build a castle here in a remote forest, far away from any strategic trade routes, not adjacent to any water source, and built inversely? Why does every stone and corridor whisper of ancient dread? Was it fear or ritual, a desperate stand against the abyss? Is it Christian superstition? Is it pagan superstition? And why do the locals tell stories of Nazis performing occult rituals at the castle during World War II? So we'll peek back in the layers of history and myth, and we'll begin with the Nazis, man. This place is pretty wild, to be honest with you, dude.
All right, let's jump straight into the 1940s. I do want to point something out, though. I think according to my research, you said 1316. What I had looked up said that it was built between 1258 or 1253 and finished in 1278. So there might be a little bit of a discrepancy there about when it was actually finished. But I do know from what I looked up, through, obviously, like I said, it's 550 years older than the United States. Mm-hmm. It was renovated, numerous times. The chapel isn't original to the actual castle. It was laid in when the pit was capped off, way later. And then, just the thing that grabbed me to this story and really made me very interested in it is that if you look at the topography of where the original wooden fortification was built, not just the stone or the stone castle building itself, is like there's an actual knoll a couple 100 feet higher than where the original wooden fort was built. And anybody that understands, and then another piece of context to this too, is that the Czech Republic nowadays represents the castle capital of the world. So there's over like 2,000 castles, I believe, in the surrounding 250 miles. Like if you draw a ring around it, and like this is where the bulk of the castles in Europe are built. Like some of the oldest that we know about, not necessarily famous castles that people know about, but just like castles in general, as you know, the Europeans were building fortifications. And so it's like these people would have known, if you're going to build a fortification, water source is absolutely paramount, because it's like, if I'm going to build a castle, I have to be able to stay inside of here and withstand siege, right? So go ahead.
I was saying, and to your point, right, when you think of castles, I didn't know that about the Czech Republic. You know, when I think of castles, my brain immediately goes to Germany and the Rhine and the Danube and the Elbe, those rivers, right? And having lived there are so many castles built right on the river. Like you can take a Rhine River cruise or a Danube River cruise, and all it is they're feeding you beer and food, and you're just looking at castles, right? Yeah. And one of my favorite castles in Germany is Cochem Castle, which is actually where the Riesling grape and wine is from. But it's built right on the Danube River, you know, and it's just this amazing place. It's creepy looking, it's beautiful at the same time, which is sort of the vibe you get from castles, and especially this region when you consider, you know, the Czech Republic and some of the history that's there. And this whole region of Europe as well is known for all kinds of myths and folklore, right? Not Czech Republic specifically, but like Romania with Vlad Dracul, Dracula, you know, werewolves and all these
Germany,
sorts of
werewolves.
things.
Yep.
Yeah. Oh yeah. You know, all this. And so this is the time period when a lot of these things are more prominent.
Oh, no, exactly. So, and by the way, the favorite castle that I ever visited was the one in Heidelberg, where you can stand. You can stand there, and I believe the Rhine River that you can see is like right at the base. So, but it goes back to exactly what we're saying. So this castle is built not on an organic water source. Right. So where are they going to get water? Which means they had to, you know,
it's a lot of work.
Send people out to get it every single day and bring it in, even while they're building it or while they're living there. Two, it's not sitting on the highest knoll in the area, which means that there's a place where you can go stand in the woodline and see almost over the ramparts of where the castle was built. And certainly
which is not ideal for defense.
Certainly would have been able to see over the wooden structure that predates the castle by several by hundreds of years. So you certainly would have been able to see over those. And so they chose a lower point on the ground. They chose a place not near a water source, and it's not on a public trade route, so nobody's visiting this castle to bring them, you know, anything from the outside world. And so those three things, to me, coupled with the fact that back in this day, this isn't like, you know, Donald Trump commissioning, you know, a tower and then within a year it's built and it's laid in. It takes these guys decades to build
anything
these structures.
Done like this was done with a purpose,
right? And you would be a part of a family and be like, my dad lived and died building this castle, and I'm still on the construction crew building this castle. And so exactly what you said, things weren't done without a great purpose. People dedicated, you know, not just lives but generations to building structures like these. And so then it makes somebody wonder, why was this structure worth that much time? And then as we get further into how it's constructed, then the mystery gets even deeper, because like I said, people spent generations building this thing. And so whether or not you believe the lore we're going to show you, they must have, because they lived and died doing it. Right. So that's incredible. So to me, that's what drew me to this mystery or this conspiracy theory.
Did you have some of the history on its period of construction and sort of anything that happened while it was being actively built? Let's go there first. That way we can sort of keep building on this context of the castle.
I pulled up some of this context. So if we were to go back to the early 13th century, there's a few things that are happening in Europe just to kind of set the stage about where we are, right? The Black Death hasn't happened yet. That's mid 1300s. That's coming in the next century. But Oxford University is founded in 1223 over in England. So you have that's happening right now. Cambridge University is 1274. So that's 4 years before this castle was finished. You have the Mongols defeated the combined forces of the kingdoms of Hungary and Poland and bring the Mongolian Empire right up to the edge of Eastern Europe. So that's happening during this time. The Battle of Falkirk takes place in 12. Sorry for mispronouncing that. In 1298. So then you have Scotland pulling away from and getting their freedom. Setting the stage
live fire
for them exactly from the UK, and so that's happening right now. You have basically the Fourth Crusade captures Constantinople just it's 1202, so 60 years prior to this castle being finished. So there's a lot of things in Europe as far as us watching the big map move and change colors, both with the early Christian church and the Holy Roman Empire, as well as the UK and the the rest of us German Saxon people that's taking place. And then UK is setting the stages for what would become the foundations for Western civilization and some of its most learned institutions in the world. And that's all happening around the borders of the Czech Republic. And then here in the middle is kind of what we would consider like the dark places of Europe, where this thing is happening kind of right in the middle of all of that, which I thought was very interesting.
Well, I like that you went there, and I think it's going to change up the direction when I talk about it. I'm going to go with some of the history stuff that I pulled up too before we talk about the Nazis, to keep you guys in the live chat wanting more, right? If we dive into the truly juicy stuff. But okay, so this is 9th century Bohemia when all this stuff starts. We talk about the wooden fortification and all this stuff, right? Now the Czech Republic, right? I wanted to make the point that at the time period in which Slavibor built this wooden fortification for Husek, that this area, this region of Bohemia, had not yet truly been touched deeply by the Christian faith. Deeply. Yeah. No pun intended. And that most of the Slavic tribes in this area were polytheistic, or what you would call pagan, right? And the Celts before them that occupied this area, obviously the Celts are famously pagan, right? So what does paganism center around? Animism, a pantheon of deities related to natural forces and elements. That's basically the definition, right? So you have pagan rituals, sacred groves, local gods, right? These are things that these people did in their lives all the time. And it's and there were gods that were kind of known to everybody who worshipped, in a pagan way. But there was even, like it says, local deities too, to specific smaller groups of people that these people would worship, right? So, but in the late 9th century, this region would be taken over by what was called Great Moravia, which is where you see the true broader introduction of the Christian faith to this area. So it's important to understand that there's a heavy pagan and then a new Christian way of thinking. And I actually think that the movie Beowulf does a really, really good job of articulating this very well. And if you've read the book Beowulf, you know this too, is a trope through the book, is that if you remember the characters in the movie or the book, they discuss, like, are we tributing the old gods or the new gods? And he's like, which god is it, right? And you have to understand that these people are coming together and meshing these different different ways of thinking. And it's sort of the Christianity of the time here is a very violent brand of Christianity. These people, are some of the word what you would think of when you think of Vikings, the Saxons. These people are worshiping in this way, and they were raised on these sorts of different pagan ideas and all these different things. So just contextualize the period of time here, But like I said, this is largely due to Christian influence due to who are now Saints Cyril and Saint Methodius. They're two Byzantine missionaries, and they basically were sent by the Byzantine Emperor in 863 to this region with something called the Glagolithic script. Never heard of that. Maybe you have, Chris. It says it's a translated liturgical text into Old Church Slavonic, which facilitated the spread of the Christian teachings. But so ironically, Ottokar's daughter would be married to the first Christian Christian Duke of Bohemia. And she was later canonized as well as Saint Ludmilla. Ludmilla was canonized for her work in bringing Christianity to the region. And her grandson was Wenceslas, which, if you're familiar with the Christmas Carol, right? Good King Wenceslas technically was not a king, but that was her grandson. And it also eventually led to her death, and why she was canonized, because she was martyred essentially for her role in bringing Christianity to the region, and then her influence on her grandson with Christianity, right? So she played this key role, and Drahomira, which was Wenceslas's mom, had her strangled to death by a scarf, essentially over their disagreements between Christianity and paganism, and then her influence over her son's life, which is pretty wild.
Religion at parties, guys.
That's right, dude. Thanksgiving is coming up. You guys better be careful. But it's just kind of funny, we talked about just before, just the violence of this area. It is what it is. That assassination.
It doesn't happen exactly in this area, but to give somebody like kind of a context of what you're talking about is like a visual metaphor. If you've seen the movie The Northman, which I thought was an excellently made film, you're talking about more of like the Viking society at the time, but it's more or less kind of around the same period of history.
Yeah.
And if you kind of watch, there's a scene in there where he does his little like unconventional warfare campaign, which anybody that ever, if you guys are thinking about joining the military and you want to see like what unconventional warfare looks like at its purest form, watch that movie. It's a fantastic film. But he does that section where he pulls out the chieftain's son, and then he crucifies him to the wall and mutilates his body and like leaves it there. But when the rest of the village comes out and they see it, and they see the Christian iconography around the way that he was killed in his sleep, they talk about those Christian bastards and how they came in, and the way that when you were talking about the violence of the time period and the idea of how like Christianity was definitely not the fluffy bunny rainbows and unicorn poop religion that people try to make it out today. Like, no, right. these groups of people, especially like the Franks, the Visigoths, and the they were absolutely at war, and their ideologies were at war. And like I said, you have the Fourth Crusade that had happened just 60 years before this. So all that stuff is happening during this time period. And then one other thing I wanted to give people, just to kind of like set the context into your mind, if you're not very familiar with paganism, and especially early European paganism, probably the most talked about or understood thing that you would have coming forward from that has been kind of like popularized in modern culture would be like Saturnarian. The idea that we bring the life from the outside, which, going to the 1800s, you have the Queen in London that saw the Bavarian tradition of bringing in the Tannenbaum or the Christmas tree roots itself back to these pagan traditions in these Central European areas to bring the life from outside into the living space and preserve the spirits that were attached to it through the dead of the winter, and then giving them credence or sacrificing to them, so that way you would have blessed times heading into the spring and everything else. That kind of sets you the idea of like these are some of the pagan traditions that you would be familiar with, that you've seen get quote unquote Christianized as we've moved through the centuries and then come forward, and that comes out of this area of Europe for sure. And
no, that's a great point, because you got to consider when you're living in the 9th century, anybody even today, you think about seasonal affective disorder. This is what people in the modern world complain about during the winter, right? Consider the fact that back in the 9th century, you're having to prepare for winter when food is scarce. You can't travel. Everything, all the trees, are barren for the most part. The fields are barren. And so the point of bringing the tree into the house is to bring some sort of joy, and to bring the life back into your life every day, and not just the dark, bleak, the sun is going down early, all these things, so these things have a lot more.
That just could you imagine being like the stable boy in like Houska Castle, and it's like it's your job to go into the cavern or go down into the cellar every day, and it's like bring up the wine or like the grain or whatever. And you're like, Mom, I don't want to go down there. It's weird. And they're like, shut up.
Right? Yeah. No, your alternative is death, essentially. Yeah. You know what I mean? So what do you prefer? What do you prefer, Hans? But no, man, it's just like you think of like everything. When you consider all these traditions we have now, like they mean a lot to people for the most part. And I think that some of that is going away. But a lot of this that you're talking about, Chris, in this era had a hell of a lot more meaning than it does today. You know, sure. These things are very serious and they're taken this way. And they're, it's religious in a sense, and it is religious in every sense, but it's religious in the sense that it provides this sort of light in your life the way religion does, these practices. And there's even Christians who think that having a Christmas tree is a bad idea because it takes away from, Christ or whatever. But that's a whole nother conversation. Yeah. But
I would say not, I don't want to divert this too much, but this is pre-consumer culture. Consumer culture isn't even
exactly
like even thought about at this point. This is survival culture.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. I mean, there were no plastic Christmas trees,
Right.
Yeah.
Sorry,
so for
Charlie,
context, so for context, that's why Ludmilla was canonized for her role in bringing Christianity to the region, and then for her martyrdom. But she is actually the patron saint of Bohemia. That's her patronage. And then for context too, Wenceslaus was also canonized and martyred. He was murdered by his brother Boleslaus the Cruel. Definitely sounds like it. For their political and, again, religious disagreements. It almost sounds like one son preferred the grandmother and the other son preferred the mom, which is kind of interesting. You see these family dynamics. You consider like in what's it called? The Plantagenet, England, where Richard the Lionheart definitely prefers his mom, Eleanor of Aquitaine, over his father, Henry II, right? So these religious...
immediately made me think about Jacob and Esau. How many times
there you go.
Cain and Abel. How many times have we seen this dynamic play out?
Exactly, and but anyway, so he killed Wenceslaus, and Wenceslaus is now the patron saint of the Czech Republic at large, right? So, and so let's just keep with this sort of mysticism here. After she was canonized, her remains were laid at St. George's Basilica, which is in Prague Castle, and it became a pilgrimage site. Right. And the reason why it became a pilgrimage site is essentially for its healing properties. They say that they could go and visit her site and people are healed and all these things. But the point here is the Christian and pagan...
Is this the nun whose body is miraculously preserved there?
Her body, I'm not sure. You should look it up.
I'm going to look that one up.
There are more than just one nun and one priest, I guess you'd say, that are preserved that way.
Much earlier.
That's sort of... And this actually would be
You continue. I'll look it up.
I was just going to say this actually would be an area where TJ's expertise might be, value added here. But essentially, the reason why I'm talking about the Christian and pagan overtones here is because I believe they not just explain the folklore of the region and the pit here, but it also has to do with the construction of the castle, right? Like why it's there. Yeah. And, understanding too that word of mouth or the oral tradition, they lend a lot to the demonization of the pagan culture and the religious beliefs of paganism, right? And I think it's a plausible connection to make that the legend of the pit at Houska Castle began with the pagan peoples of the region, but was further weaponized, whether intentionally or unintentionally, by the eventual Christian population, meant to subdue and supplant pagan histories and to sort of exhibit this Christian triumph over evil, which is a theme you see all over medieval Europe and the Middle East in general, and not just with Christianity, right? Consider the fact that when the Ottoman Turks sacked Constantinople, they converted the Hagia Sophia from a Christian basilica into a Muslim mosque, right? This is a pretty common trope throughout history, what people do to one another. But anyway, so I wanted to give you guys some more context here and some other instances of this happening in this region, right? So in various parts of Northern Europe, sacred groves, like I mentioned, and places used for nature worship by the Germanic and other tribes were taken over by the Christians eventually. They would build crosses, chapels, churches, and other Christian monuments were erected essentially in the face of these pagan practices on purpose. Basically, it's like a capture the flag game almost, right? Like now this land is ours by right of conquest, by right of Christian conquest. conquest. An example would be Thor's oak in Germany. It was a sacred tree revered by the Germanic tribes known as Thor's oak, and Saint Boniface in the 8th century is said to have cut it down, essentially as an example of Christians' supremacy over paganism. And the wood was used to construct a church, and this is again folklore, right? Keeping this in mind. Another example would be the Pantheon in Rome, right? This is all seen in a way that now it's no longer a pantheon of gods. It's now been taken over by, the Christian aspects of Rome and its religions, right? So, and the other thing too here to understand with paganism, that the land itself has more meaning than it would in the Christian way of viewing the world. Chasms, caves, large trees, springs, things like this, natural springs were given spiritual meaning for the most part by pagans, right? So it's not a stretch, I think, to say that this sort of lore was attached to the chasm there at Houska Castle and created this sort of mystic evil that existed for hundreds of years until Christianity eventually took over and was just another example of Christian subversion of pagan beliefs in the region. And that's, I think that plays and has a heavy footprint in the story and the lore as well. So you're trying to find the saint or whatever?
No, I found her. I'm just trying to find when she actually died. Anyway, the name of the nun was Mary Electa, the Elector of Jesus, and she's from much later. But her remains are displayed at one of the churches in Prague. So it's another interesting story. It doesn't really have much to do with what we're talking about yet, other than you just reminded me. She was born in 1605 in Italy. Spent most of her life as the prior of the Prague Carmelites monastery at, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that, where she also died at the age of 58. And then she was buried. Her remains were, there was a lot of strange happenings that happened around her remains. And when they went in and uninterred her, her body was mysteriously perfectly mummified. And now her remains are on display at one of the churches in Prague. This is another really interesting story from the area.
Yeah.
Very close to where we're talking about, but
yeah.
So that was a couple. So we're the 1200s right now. So that's 400 years post this, but just another interesting thing to look up.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, just kind of one of the points of this conversation I was trying to have is just to drive home the spiritualism, the religiosity, and the Christian and pagan overtones in this area they run very, very deep, right? Oh yes. This is an area that has changed hands a lot over time, and not just in the recent last 50 years. I mean, this is an area that's been long contested for a while. You're talking about the lush forests, the rivers, the axis.
It's gorgeous there,
right? You got to consider, this is the sort of prime real estate that if you're a medieval duke, king, whatever the hell, like you want to control this sort of land.
If I was to describe it to something that I've seen in literature, I would imagine the Czech Republic to be like Narnia. When all of a sudden you go through the wardrobe and you pop out into Narnia, and the way that C.S. Lewis describes it, and even the way that it was filmed in some of the movies, this is what you're talking about. Deep rolling forests on foothills of mountains that stretch out for miles and miles, and you get up under the tree line and it's dark and it's foreboding and it stretches on, and the silent snow is falling, and you can hear, the snap of a twig for forever a ways, and like the forest will just close in around you, and you feel like utterly and completely alone in the silence. Like this is the kind of place that you're talking about. You know what I mean? Where it's just it looks otherworldly, and that's a great picture that you got. I wish we could scan up, but if you go to the upper left, right there, that's the other knoll that I was talking about, where the castle doesn't even sit on the highest piece of topography in the immediate area, which is so strange.
This might be,
if you were going to take that much time to build something, why would you not be the tallest structure, in the surrounding landscape?
That's kind of the whole point,
they
right?
Seeded high ground to why, and so it goes back to you were talking about the original story in the 9th century when they built the wooden structure. They immediately start carving into the limestone. There it is, that higher knoll right there. It's so obviously
and there's the limestone
larger.
here.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
there's
it could
the
have been
escarpment that it sits on the
right.
edge.
This could
cliff.
be. I was thinking of like what a logical reason to not, if you could call it a logical reason to not build it over here. If you could see where the cursor is, right? Because maybe there is this flat piece of land. It could just be it's easier sort of thing, right? And this would require a ton of tree clearing and all this other stuff. Perhaps,
Maybe.
you can't go back and ask these guys, but if
they
you're
were,
looking,
I would wonder if they're building a wooden structure and they're felling timber anyway to put in, walls and buttresses and towers to guard. Like, you're going to be felling trees anyway. Why not fell trees immediately where you're building? I know it's just a question. Like,
it's totally a valid question, and maybe this is something as simple as aesthetics. Like, oh man, look at this flat slab of hard limestone. Let's just build it there because it looks cool. Like, I have no idea what goes through these people's heads, And you could even if you guys look right here, kind of where the cursor is at, if you're watching the episode, you can see how there is obvious space here because this is the middle of this right here. It goes down. See if I can find
Secret Service would never be able to get into that building.
Right.
You see how sloped those roofs are?
Exactly, dude. Too sloped. I'm trying to see if I can find. Well, here's a better one. Here's a better picture. This is actually, I like this. This is gonna be good.
Nice.
This is on the History Memes Reddit page. It says Czechs literally built a castle to protect us from doom eternal. There it is. So you can see, guys, like it's built around this chasm, right?
Yeah.
It's built around. You can see that it's protecting it. So this isn't your typical way of building a castle, which is like why I think this is so odd. We asked the question before of the question of why. You when you build things, you don't do them without a lot of purpose.
Can you pull that picture back up, because it's a really good, because we can talk about it like this when we talk about ramparts. If you look at the outer slope of the roof, it's less of an angle, at least on the not on the side that sits right over the cliff, but on the other three sides, the angle is less on the outside, which would typically be reserved for the inner walls of a castle, which would be called the rampart, so that way you could build ramps up to them. And that's where your archers or your pikemen or your defenses would run to if or when that you're ever being sieged. And then on the inside, it's got that very steep, very long slope. And that would typically be reserved for the outside of a castle, because if you have dudes trying to throw up ladders or trying to throw up hooks or whatever that century warfare would have as far as medieval siege warfare is concerned, you don't want them to be able to easily, like, again, it's the Secret Service defense method. You wouldn't want them to be able to climb your sloped roofs and be able to drop in on the other side. So it would seem that this castle is literally built with its walls inverted, the way that you would typically design defenses of the time.
A modern way to conceptualize this too would be to think about a barbed wire fence. Most of them, if they don't have both of them angled out, typically you can tell if you're building a barbed wire fence and you haven't seen its entire construction, you can tell whether it's meant to keep something in or keep something out by the angle of the barbed wire, and that's kind of the point you're trying to make.
That's so perfect. Can you pull up a picture of a modern prison and then a picture of like a modern
1 second here.
Like what would be like a DMV lot or something, because that would exactly show what you're talking about, like what prison barbed wire fences look like, and then versus like what DMV or impound lots look like, whether they're trying to keep you out with the razor wire or keep you in with it.
Yeah,
you know what I mean.
And of course,
we can describe it if you can't find it, but typically you have the Y built into the razor wire, and then it's angled toward the side where it's like if you're trying to climb, your head's going to get in the razor wire, and you can't get any higher on the fence because you're like like it's in my way. And that's exactly what we're talking about.
This is a good example here. This one, it's
there you
angled
go.
one way, and obviously there's all different. Like this is, I would say this is a pretty simple way to do it. A lot of them now, they look like this. Let me kill the that's what I'm about to pull up here. They look like this.
Yeah, there you go.
But as with the previous photo, you can see that it's built one way, and the entire intent there is to keep people out from crawling in, right? Because it's angled over to where you'd have to go under and then over the top of it. And that's kind of the whole point. And that's the point you're making here. And I'm going to pull back up the castle so you can sort of tie that all in here. But that's the point you're making with the angles and the slopes of these roofs and all this stuff.
Right. Yeah. So if you could see that, it would be, you know, if you had the ability to climb this castle, getting up over that outside angle and onto the easement is much simpler from the outside than it is from that inside angle coming up and out. Mm-hmm. It's very, like, again, if it took them 1253 to 1278, you know, 17 years. Don't ever do math in public. But if it took them that many years to construct these buttresses and these walls to come up with this stone structure, why would they waste the time to build it that way? Like, again, don't give me, you know, it was an accident or anything like that. These people don't spend decades building structures,
that's ridiculous.
and they did it wrong. Like, it's not like the dude took the schematic. It's not like the dude took the schematics and he was like,
yeah, it's not like that Far Side sketch where the pyramid construction was just off just a little bit, you know?
Yeah.
Here, look, like, and here's even a better shot. You can see down
that's
into
a
the
great
inside.
one.
Yeah.
Yeah, it looks like an antlion trap.
Not sure what an antlion trap is.
An antlion? If you're ever out in the desert, we have them like all over the Southwest. You see like the little pits in the ground. Mm-hmm. Like, we used to do it all the time when we were out at NTC. You'd see like the little pits in the ground, and they just formed these like little reverse volcanoes. And you're like, there's an ant lion in the bottom of there. And then you would like, if you could find an ant or like a spider or something, you throw it down in the pit where it is, and there's an insect that lives down there just below the surface. And whenever dirt starts to fall down, the ant lion comes out and he throws, like, the ant lion will throw the dirt at the top of the rim. And the affecting insect is like trying to climb out, but he's like facing an avalanche the entire time, and eventually he falls down in the middle of the pit, and the antlion grabs him and pulls him down below the surface of the dirt and eats his ass. Like, that's what the castle reminds me of when you look at it. It looks like an antlion.
This is the middle. This is it right here. This is it. So if you can see the picture here, I'll just read the caption. It says, Houska Castle is haunted by normal ghosts. A human frog bulldog-like creature is said to roam the castle halls. The courtyard is haunted by a headless ghost with blood gushing out of its wound. Many shadow people have been seen, and there's even cases of poltergeist activity. The demonic artwork throughout the castle does not give people a comfortable feeling either. Some claim that visiting the castle brings bad luck. There's actually some pretty good photos on this site that I'm going to scroll through here so people can look at.
Yeah,
Here's the chapel that's built over the site, so you can see. Obviously, all the frescoes are pretty faded here, but there is one of Saint Michael stepping on.
I was hoping you were going to bring that one up. Yeah,
go ahead. I was just going to say there's.
No,
one
I was just hoping
Michael.
you were going to bring up the picture of Saint Michael. Yeah. It's a
very quintessential
famous
image
in there.
Mm-hmm. Very quintessential image of Saint Michael with his foot and spear on a dragon, which is meant to represent the devil, and Christ's triumph over evil, over Satan. And that's one of the images here inside.
So what's interesting about them invoking the image of Saint Michael is that goes back to some of the earliest manuscripts of the Old Testament. Because we don't really see St. Michael show up in the New Testament at all. You see Gabriel show up because he's typically associated as the messenger of God. But St. Michael, one place where people might be familiar with him is in the Old Testament scripture where it talks about an archangel leading the hosts of heaven against a warring demonic faction being Satan himself. And Jesus talks about this briefly in the New Testament where he says, I saw, as it were, Satan being cast out of heaven like a bolt of lightning, implying that Jesus was there, which is one of the Christianics of scripture where I don't mean to get off into theology, but that's one of the places where we see Jesus talk about actually being the Son of God.
It's a heavy theme of that.
And being eternal. That's where Saint Michael is typically associated. He's the patron saint of warriors, He's very heavily associated with war and the warrior culture, and it's very interesting that they build that chapel over top of the pit, and then that's the iconography, the Christian iconography that they use. It's some of the earliest Christian iconography that they would have had during that time frame.
So
and yeah, go ahead. I just find it interesting that they come up with him. Like they didn't come up with Jesus. They didn't use Jesus Christ. They didn't use the Immaculate Conception. They didn't use Jesus on the cross, which would all be associated with sacrifice, new birth.
Well, it's interesting
mercy.
That you say that.
They didn't use any of that. They chose the Christian warrior iconography from Old Testament.
Well, to your point, this is perfect what it says, but this is some art inside. It says it's a guard on the outside of where the hole, the cistern is, the chasm. This creepy image right here that I'm circling with the cursor. But I'll read what this says. It says the chapel is dedicated to the Saint Michael, the archangel, who in the Book of Revelation leads the fight against Satan. Faded Gothic frescoes on the wall depict Archangel Michael battling a dragon and another of him with a small devil tied up on the end of a pole. The other figures are saints such as Andrew and Christopher, save for a curious depiction of a left-handed female centaur. I'll have to look that up. The left-handedness was often associated with evil, and the centaur is a half-human beast. Why she is female and an archer is not explained, but the figure has no links to Christian iconography, and its roots are pagan. So here we go again, right? These pagan and Christian
I have
overtones.
something. Yeah, I have something on the pagan iconography of that. So the idea you talked about it earlier about often they would see chimera, emerging from the pit. So just for anybody that isn't caught up on that, chimera is a Greek term. It stands for any type of anthropomorphic animal mixed with a human being. So in the Greek tradition, the chimera was a creature that was half human, half
I looked it up for you.
Scorpion, I believe, and its tail had the head of a viper on the end of it.
So I'll just tell you what this is. It says that it is in Greek mythology was a fire-breathing female monster.
Right.
With
and
a
female was important.
Head.
I hadn't gotten to that yet, but yeah.
Female monster with a lion's head, a goat's body, and a serpent's tail. That's what it says right here.
So, so chimeras are any anthropomorphic, and the chimera is standing upright like a human. So that's where the human part comes from. And then if you go and you look into Revelation, there's also chimera that are depicted in the end of Revelation, where John, the beloved, talks about creatures emerging from a pit that's gashed in the earth. So this is very interesting that we're getting into this, where they come up and they're as big as a war horse. They have the head of human beings, but tails like scorpions, and they wield giant spears, and they torment mankind. So that's even seen in Scripture, in the New Testament, in Revelation, where we see chimera. But often the female part of that goes back to the pagan, like the stories of like the witches and everything that hang out in the woods and sacrifice children. And it also goes back to legends of like the succubus that draws on men's souls and drains the life out of them. And I think like some of the other legends that go back into that would be there's a Bavarian legend of a witch that sneaks into people's houses and drains them of their life force. Obviously I already talked about, you have the Greek succubus. Like it all goes back to that, where for whatever reason in ancient pagan iconography, like the evilest of the evil. Oh, in Greek you have Medusa, that with one look can turn men into stone, and she's also a chimera with hair like snakes and yeah. So it goes back to this idea that I think the serpent and female association has to go back to the Garden of Eden, doesn't it? It does, yeah, very, yeah. So very much so, and also there's other pagan iconography that talks about the serpent, but and the dragon. If you go into Far Eastern mythology, then you would see the dragon, which also is depicted like that. But it has something to do with the fact that when the spirit of man is twisted to the absolute evil, you see that often it's depicted as female for whatever reason, and then very often what's associated with that is it's not so much that the female consumes the male, it's that the female demands and consumes children. And that's also very, very closely associated with that, where it always demands the sacrifice of children to it. But so anyway, so that's why left-handed is used here. She's left-handed. It's a female. She's not of this world because she's a chimera, half horse. She's half human being, and so. Yeah, so you have like kind of that conglomeration of all of that iconography together in one, and so it's very, very interesting to me.
I think this is pretty cool, and you see, and we'll move on after this, but these images, you can see sort of the way it looks over here, and they're very faded, and then this is definitely a reconstructed art here, so you can see kind of what it may have looked like back then, but you can see there's the devil hanging on the end in a little pot, it says here, and then Saint Michael stabbing the dragon with the spear, right? Yeah. And there's a lot of Christian iconography there with the spear as well, right? The spear of destiny, all of that, so which we'll get to. But anyway, I thought that was pretty cool, and this you guys can see here what it looks like, but kind of go back to what we were talking about before, essentially, is the practical.
Sorry for meandering so much.
No, that's okay. No. I mean, this is part of the process, man. But like the practicality of building the castle and the decision that he made to build it there, and the question of why, right? Was this, did he build it essentially to assuage fears and rumors? That there was a sort of a need here to establish trust and assert power. So he essentially throws the superstition to the, throws the superstition a bone, essentially, and builds a castle over this to garner trust, essentially as a means of bringing stability. Is it really because there was something evil in the hole there? What is the reason is sort of the question.
Yeah, who knows? I do know, according to the oral tradition, and this goes back to the 9th century original wooden structure of the fort. Well, we'll just call it Fort Houska versus Houska Castle, just to keep things in our minds coherent. But it was when they were trying to mine the limestone to build the original fort that the pit opens up. And then it was said of legend that originally they just tried to fill the pit in, and they would throw stones into it day and night, and they never even heard them hit the ground.
Right.
And then that's where you started seeing people talk about seeing, bat-like creatures roam the countryside.
Leathery black wings is one of the descriptions.
Specifically at night. There's another... Oh, this one was very interesting to me. There's another oral tradition of a group of almost like Chang gang prisoners that are being led across the valley in front of the castle that people see sometimes, and they say that they're chained together, dark cloaks, no faces. And as they're walking along, they're being attacked by large black dog-like beasts that are tearing them limb from limb. And as the prisoners that are all chained together walk along, they only stop to pick up their severed limbs and then continue marching, across.
I heard about that.
So in there, you see a lot of like the large black dog-like beasts. Now you're talking about hellhounds, which are always a harbinger of death. If you see people chained together, that's more iconography that talks of hell and people being eternally tortured and being torn apart by beasts of hell and forced to roam the countryside without rest. So all of that comes into that ghost story too, which many people say that they've seen. Even so, I want to say that it was as early as the 20th century was the last time that they let a visitor stay at Houska Castle overnight. And then for whatever reason, during the night, one of the travelers who people said had not been showing any signs of mental distress or anything of whatever reason threw themselves out of their bedroom window that night. And, so again, take that back. I think that's probably one of the stories that gets caught up in the self-fulfilling prophecy of the place while people continue to add stories to it. I haven't been able to actually find any corroborating evidence that somebody as late as the 1900s did that, because you would think you'd be able to find like an obituary or something, which I haven't been able to. But it definitely adds to the lore of the place. And then there has to be something to the story, because after the year that I found that story was said to have happened, they did close the castle off and stop allowing people to stay in it like a hostel overnight.
Yeah, and it did fall into it did fall into a lot of disrepair once the that region was controlled by the USSR. It was used, as said, I read too, as a sanatorium at one point for storage, all these things, and it wasn't being upkept like it had been before, prior to the Iron Curtain, as it were. But that's just the kind of thing here. Like what you're talking about is like the utility of not just the castle, but the utility of the story as well as a tool, I guess you should say, right? Because if you are Ottokar and you are trying to establish and assert dominance over this area, and you have all of these people that are aware of this this region over here of our kingdom or dukedom or whatever it is, because he wasn't a king, and there's this evil hole in the ground, and there's all this folklore around it. You are a group of people who are becoming Christian, right? And or you are a Christian, excuse me. You're a group of Christians, and you have these pagan overtones in this thing over here, and part of your region, like, there's utility in it to use to garner trust, right? You're going to say, okay, guys, okay.
Or intimidation.
Or intimidation, sure. But in this, I would say that in this aspect of it here, that there's more of a use for the trust as he built the castle here, right? As a sort of like protection. So like when you ask about like motivation for building the castle, like, is it essentially to garner trust for the people that live in this region, or is it essentially because you do believe that there is some sort of evil here, so you're building a castle, right? But then you consider too, if you're going to,
are you to say that like, oh, that's the big bad Duke that sealed off the hole and he protects us from the gate to hell? So is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, like that. Okay. You're doing it to garner trust by first acknowledge you're using it. There's utility in the story, right? Sure. You're using it to acknowledge and say, okay, cool. There's a problem I can give a solution to, right? So you're garnering trust by building this castle over this hole that has all these evil spirits that come in and out of it, right? And you're doing it here to, again, it asserts strength, it asserts dominance, and then you're also gaining a foothold, a practical, defensible foothold in this region, right? Because essentially,
a version of Hearts and Minds.
Yeah, a coin ops, as it were, right? Yeah. Because eventually there would be trade routes that appeared in this area. And when you consider sort of the documentation that is available of who resided at Houska Castle, the people that resided there, it wasn't knights. It wasn't like set up constantly. It's not like this thing that when you think of this and we talk about like it's facing inward. There wasn't like a couple hundred years like the Wall and Game of Thrones where there's just constantly people posted there and they're looking out for the White Walkers, right? There was never a garrison of troops at Castle Houska or Houska that was just intently looking down into a hole at all times with spears and crossbows and bolts and all this stuff, right, ready for the devil to jump out. It was never there. It had a heavily administrative role and managing trade routes is some of the history that I read. There was a utility there that wasn't just to guard this hole in the ground. Is it appeasement, right? There's some appeasement in building this there, and maybe also the way it was built is a symbolic gesture to the ever watchful eye of Christ over evil and protecting, right? Because there's so much symbology that these people lend to everyday life, right? You kind of get where I'm going with this?
I do. There was two other theories that I had too. One has to do with, I guess I had to kind of suspend my belief about the why originally, and then get to why was it maintained? Because to your point earlier, if they chose maybe just a slightly less advantageous position down the knoll for the original, because we have to remember it's like, Fort Houska and then Castle Houska. So It's like maybe as it went along and the reputation grew, there was a reason that we're missing, that they chose that spot for the original Fort Houska. But then as it goes along, right, do we have a Vlad the Impaler situation where it becomes more advantageous to capitalize on the reputation of the area as a defensive
like a
posture,
deterrence almost.
A deterrence where it's like, like any force that comes in, we don't want to go up there. That's where the devil lives, and those weird people, so there could be that. And then the other theory that I had too is they drilled or did their best to drill into a solid limestone rock. Did they find something of value there that
so this is a cover up?
That could be. I mean, something
Fair
that
point.
was valuable to them back then that we don't know of, or even they expected to find something of value that never materialized, and so it's more of a mine operation or something like. And then and then to that point, all of the deterrence and keeping people away from whatever they were trying to protect would still be a valid theory. But it's like those were my two theories that stayed away from the paranormal. That's like what could possibly make this a valid place to build this castle, and then why are they trying to keep something in it and not let it out?
I think the notion that it could have been a cover up initially because they found something there worth value. They did abandon it pretty fast. So
it doesn't hold water.
And the castle was built a couple hundred years later. And I just wanted to say too, like for everybody listening, like I never want to say this is what it is, right? Because I just don't.
No. We're speculating. We're 100%. Speculating hella hard.
But it is. This is like I said at the beginning of the episode. This is part of the fun of having these conversations. But I try to put myself in this position and say, what's the utility? What's the motivation for building this? Like, did he truly believe that he was protecting people, protecting himself, protecting his area, right, from an evil that lived in the hole, or was he appeasing a group of people and using this as a tool, essentially, to his benefit? To say, look, I did this, I'm taking care of you, I built this, and when you look at it, like it is a relatively small castle in comparison to what a Heidelberg would have looked like, to your point, right? In fact, let me just pull up Heidelberg here.
You can do that. I'm gonna take a leak while you pull that up and show it to the people.
Yeah, because I just want to make a point to what you were saying about the intent and the intention on building a castle like this. It is small enough, I guess, conceivably to say, like, well, I can throw you a bone in your mind. You're having this conversation to yourself, and I'll build this relatively small fortification, right? So this is Heidelberg Castle in Germany. You can see how big this is. And I mean, as compared to Houska Castle, it's much small, or Houska Castle is much smaller. And Heidelberg is a real castle in that it had a garrison and it defended itself. You can kind of see here, this was a tower, and you can see it's been sheared off because of cannon fire. Actually, and I can pull up some other pictures here because Heidelberg is really cool. Actually, this is a perfect one right here to do this. You can see right here what I'm talking about. So you can see this is sheared off right there. I would like to find, now that we're talking about it, this is showing something else. The wildlife that lives there. I want to look up how old Heidelberg Castle. Maybe to sort of make the point here about... okay, so perfect, right? So to my point that I was trying to say is that, Castle Houska is relatively small in compared to like the size of Heidelberg Castle.
Yeah, it's tiny.
Okay, and it's small enough to where you could build it.
It fits inside the courtyard of
Yeah,
Heidelberg.
you could build it and say conceivably that you did something, but it's not the effort that a Heidelberg is, right? So Heidelberg here, it says the earliest castle structure was built before 1214. Okay.
Yeah.
And as it was expanded into 2 castles in 1294. Okay. So this is, like we were just saying, okay, it's being built around the same time and even earlier, right, than Castle Houska. So the point I was trying to make here, that you are able to, and the idea of the conception of building a castle as large as Heidelberg was something people were doing at the time. So you could say relatively he knew that he wasn't building something so grandiose that it was going to take up so much resource and time. He could also get away with building it and saying he did it. And actually, I'm going to share this photo.
If you were to compare it to those types of structures in the day,
There you go.
it almost looks like
way bigger.
It almost looks like an outpost.
Exactly.
You would even call it an outpost.
And if you've lived in Europe, there are
I mean?
actually these little outposts that you're talking about.
I love that castle. That was
too.
one of my favorite.
If you've
trips
ever
in my
lived in
childhood.
Europe, sprinkled, especially in Germany, sprinkled throughout, you can see it like off the Autobahn. There are places like Houska Castle, or even like a quintessential tower that would come to mind when you think of medieval towers. Just off in the trees, you'll see it, right? Because this is what and how they live. But like, the point I'm trying to make here.
Houska Castle is the size of that central quadrant right there with all the windows in it.
Yep, exactly.
It's about that
and
big.
a courtyard exists on the other side of this. And that's kind of the point I'm trying to make. This is as large of a castle as they were building at the time that Houska was constructed. And Houska is small enough, in my opinion, to say that I can check a box if I'm Ottokar, right? I could check a box by saying that I'm building a structure to protect my people from the evil in this hole, but it's not as big of a task as Heidelberg Castle, right? Something
really
this
good point.
large, and he sort of checks that box. And I want to say too, this is Heidelberg. What you can see, there is so much more on the other side, okay? And then there's wine cellars that go all the way up underneath this. Like here's the famous wine cellar, or the
Been
big
there.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's so
a painting of it. I was trying to see if I could find an image real quick of the courtyard. Here we go. This is a good one.
There
right
you go.
here.
Right
you
over
can
the
see.
Rhine. Yes.
Yep. Yeah. You can see this is like an aerial view of the castle. Houska would, like you said, Chris, fit right in here. And just a little gee whiz info, if you guys can see right here, this green area on the side here, the whoever was residing over the castle would fill it with deer and then hunt them from the walls here. That was what they did for fun back in the day.
There's a point in that wall too. It's
Can we
not
pull it back
like,
up?
It doesn't matter. There's a point in there where it's not like the famous Shamrock in Ireland. However, there's a point in
the
there
whole Blarney Stone thing?
that's very not the Blarney Stone, but there's a point in there where it's pretty famous for people to climb up, and then you can actually hang out of the outer the inner escarpment there and see and like look down, and
It's true.
It's such. I spent 12 hours there one day. It's
amazing.
It's so cool. And then one other point that I wanted to make about the Heidelberg Castle when you go, and I said something similar about this about Houska earlier, is when you stand in the courtyard of Heidelberg and you look at the walls. And there's these, maybe you can find a picture of them. There's these beautiful statues on the inner courtyard wall that face the inside, so you can see the statues that represent, I believe it's the royal, or all the royal families that stayed there.
Yeah.
But when you look at the rows of the statues, and check me if my math is wrong on this, but you can look at them and you can literally say each wall represents, I think it's like 500 years of statues.
Something like that.
Is it 500 or is it 300? But it's hundreds. It's hundreds of years each layer. And when you look at them and the layers go all the way up. It just
right
I was dumbstruck.
The statues.
Yeah, there they are, the statues, right? And I was dumbstruck. There they are, and how intricate they are. I was dumbstruck the day that I was there, and I remember counting down from the top wall, and I was like, "There's America." and then the wall keeps
Right.
going down, and you're just like, it's insane to me, because one of the things that my dad told me growing up, is like the average American just doesn't have any concept of European history, because we teach our history so ethnocentrically here in America, where it's like, gosh dang it, the world started in 1776, and you're like, you're like, dude, it goes
This is
back
sort
so
of
much
a
further
goofy
than that.
photo here, like for tourism with the couple,
Oh, yeah.
right? But look how big this is, right? Look at them here in the
what I'm
foreground
saying.
and just how big this wall is with all of these statues, right?
That's
like,
what I'm saying. When you stand there,
This
you
is
have
the sort of construction.
You have no concept of like what you're looking at, and this is just a 13th century castle. Like, I have not yet been to see the pyramids, right?
Sure.
And so just a small thing I want to say on this when we talk about these conspiracy theories, because I hope we have a plan to talk about like Pharaoh Tutankhamun coming up, and we're going to go back thousands of years when we do that one, but it's like the idea that your worldview fits inside of this really small cup, right? Or that, and here's the one that kills me, when they look at the history of humanity, the idiocracy to believe that we're at the smartest and the most sophisticated that we've ever been, that the arc of humanity only ever sends us upward, is ludicrous to me, because even if you just look at recorded history that we can see, taking you from the Dark Ages from like the early 1st century AD, and the libraries that we know about in the Middle East, to the 1300s in Europe, would suggest that we were way smarter before this, and then we fell off quite a ways in 300 years, and then we rose again to the 1800s, 1900s, into the Industrial Revolution. So it's like, even in the arcs of history that we can even measure, we know that we were really smart here, and we were doing... we were studying the stars, and we developed math, and we did all these things as humanity. And then here, half of us died off, and we call it the Dark Ages for a reason, because nothing was happening. And then
that's
here,
definitely a historical misnomer.
We developed. Well, but what I'm saying is, like, we weren't accomplishing anything globally. Well, no, I can't say it that way either. But there are parts of humanity that dove off and went dark. And then we come out on the other side, and then we say, here's Europe in the 1800s, and we developed the steam engine, and then the airplane, and then all these things that we went on to do there. It's like, even if you look at those micro arcs of history, right? To say that history, like the arc of humanity, only ever says that we're only ever improving. No, that's a retarded thing to say. So it's a super retarded thing to say. And so if you go back and you look at the things that people have built, even like these structures that we're talking about now, Houska and Heidelberg Castle and stuff like this, would suggest that human beings were at one point, at least the average human being, right? The average mason, the average architect, right? The average was much more industrious and much smarter, right, than we are today. These kids sitting around scrolling on TikTok. So it's like, don't sit around and tell me that we can't, like, oh, it must have been aliens, because if we don't know how they did it, then I don't, like, it doesn't make any sense.
And this time
like,
period,
shut up, dude.
This time period we're talking about, when Houska was being constructed, was only about 140 years off from
that point.
The Italian Renaissance. Just to give even further, but so I wanted to. So this concept of the portal to hell,
get me back on topic,
is not a unique thing to Houska, and it's used in Hollywood pretty often. The movie Constantine comes to mind. It's the portal. There's an old horror movie, I think from the 70s, called it was like The Apartment Upstairs or something like that, about a portal to hell in an apartment. But I wanted to kind of go over some of the other.
Greece had its Styx and its portal to the underworld that was guarded by Medusa at one point.
Oh, sure.
Like, every culture has one.
Right. And so I want to start by showing some of these in these other places that either are considered to have a quote unquote portal to hell, or there is some sort of religious Christian church or iconography or monument built to protect the surrounding area from evil. Okay.
Interesting.
Right. So the first one I wanted to show is Sedlec Ossuary, which is in Czech Republic. And you guys may know this one. It says it's a chilling chapel decorated with thousands of human bones, or otherwise known as the Bone Church. And I want to show this is not that far from Houska Castle. Look at all the bones.
Oh shit.
So this is kind of what I was talking about here. It was built to ward off evil spirits. This is a place, it doesn't have the whole portal to hell lore thing here, but the church itself was built on purpose to bring in Christianity and to ward off evil, essentially, right? And it's this concept, again, this trope of Christianity triumphing over the pagan evil, all of these things, which I feel personally has the most influence in sort of this story here.
Christianity is the one world religion where Jesus Christ dies, descends to hell, is there for 3 days, and then conquers death and the grave and comes back.
Right.
So I mean, every other religion in the world, all of the deities, like Hades rules in the underworld, but he didn't die. Persephone goes down to the underworld to be with Hades, but she didn't die. Right? They don't say that the deity ever actually dies and gives up its spirit. They just say they go there, like they can physically go there and come back. Religion would have like Anubis, like he rules the underworld, but he's alive in the underworld.
But there is the story, and I could look it up to get it 100% right, so don't come at me too hard in the comments. But the story of I think it's Osiris or Horus who is killed and then resurrected. He's put back together essentially.
Yep, that's Egyptian.
By his sister,
it
right?
Is.
So to your
yeah, there is that one.
The other one I wanted to bring up too here is the Hellfire Club, right? And you can see this is the entrance to the Hellfire Club caves. This is in Montpelier Hill, Ireland. It's built on an ancient burial site, so a pagan burial site. And the Hellfire Club's ruins have tales of dark rituals and hauntings, as you know. But this is specifically a meeting place for people who are, there's some Freemasonry here that's said to go on. We all, can jump into the conspiracy theories about the Freemasons, which isn't the point of this episode, but the point I'm making here is that there was devil worship supposedly that had gone on here as well. A lot of evil, conspiracy of murder, all these things because of the dark nature of it and this sort of portal into the devil, into Satanism, all these things. This is a place that exists as well.
So can I amend my statement of what I was trying to say earlier?
Yeah, please.
Yes, I looked up Osiris and Horus, and you're absolutely, or sorry, was killed by his brother Seth.
Yeah.
In an ancient Egyptian myth, and you're right. The difference that I was trying to say is in the Christian theology, Jesus Christ was a man. Was not he was God, but like this is I don't want to get off into the person of Jesus Christ, but the idea was that Jesus Christ was a man. He was 100% man, was crucified, died, and was buried, and then rose again and was a man again before he was taken into heaven, versus Osiris and Seth were all considered deities, and even though they were killed, their bodies were torn asunder. Like they were always deities. They never became physical men.
Sure.
So that was what I was trying to get at in the difference between the Christian theology. So,
got you.
So thank you for checking me on that. But
no, you're good. So the next one is the reason I'm showing all this stuff, like I said, is just to show like this concept of a portal to hell and the construction of things over the top of them is not a uncommon trope, especially in Europe, right? This is Castle Panari in Romania. It says it's connected also to Vlad the Impaler, who, as you guys know, is Vlad Dracul or Dracula, right? The inspiration for Dracula. The fortress looms high in the Carpathian Mountains and was supposedly a stronghold to protect against dark invaders, human and otherwise. And it is guarded by a darkness, is what it says, so this is here, right? This was constructed essentially to guard against dark invaders like it says, human or otherwise. So I think this is sort of a funny way to look at it. And I just kind of thought of it this way, right? There is this sort of human notion that we have domain over the unseen forces of evil. And it's almost so funny to conceptualize it in the way of building a castle, which is at the time, which is the most prolific and a stout way of defending anything from anything is to have a castle. So like, it's almost funny, it's the what's the word? The egotism of man to build a castle and say, this is it. This is where humanity will make its last stand against the evil,
it's
right?
Epic. It's epic last stand.
Yeah.
That kind of reminds me of the Old Testament story of the Tower of Babel or Babel, depending on how you were raised, because the idea was mankind said, I'm going to, which is very similar verbiage as when you talk about Satan himself, like, I will ascend on high, I will be like God, and I will build a tower into the heavens. But what's very interesting about that chapter in Genesis, which is Genesis chapter 6, get me wrong in the chat if it is, but it's early Genesis, is that God looks down and he says to the other deities around him, if left to their own devices, there is nothing that they will not accomplish. And so then God comes down and confuses their language. So I think there is something to the creative ability of man, the architecture of man. And we've talked about this on this channel many times, to where it is, if man is made in God's own image, what is it that makes man in God's own image? And one of the things is that we desire to build things into eternity, things that will outlast us. We have the ability to write, music and poetry and design art and things that are, conceptually even outside of the world that we see, which is, creative in nature. Nothing else in nature does that. And so even for God himself to say, if left to their own devices, there's nothing they will not accomplish, I think says a lot about mankind, and why also the hubris of mankind. If made in God's own image, why would we think that we couldn't build a castle that would keep the very forces of hell at bay?
Yeah.
Why wouldn't we think that, But I do want to rotate, because there was something we said that we were going to talk about that we haven't even gotten to, because we spent all of our time in the 13th century of Europe. But this castle has an entire arc of story that stretches into World War II. Which is very, very interesting. It is, because you were saying earlier that, maybe it was I said deterrence, you said maybe it was a sense of like protection, or like, like, look what I can do, look what I can build. But whether it was deterrence or not, the reputation of the structure and the iconography and the ghost stories that surround it definitely caught the sight of some of history's greatest bad guys,
enemies. Yeah.
And it was at least strong enough that even Heinrich Himmler in the 1940s sent troops there to go check it out. And I thought it was very interesting that during one of the renovations coming into the 20th century, and this was very interesting to me, they found Nazi soldiers not buried on the grounds, but buried under the floorboards of the castle. Yeah. So why under the floorboards? Why did they put them there?
I think that is sort of the occultism at play here, right? And again, this is a lot of this is speculation, because there was documentation assumed to be burned after the Nazis left this region when they were starting to lose the war against the Soviets, right? And that essentially they may have burned a lot of this stuff to kind of cover up that they were there, right? Sort of a hiding history thing. But yeah, there's one of the rumors there at Houska Castle was that the Nazis were there as part of the Lebensborn project, which is supposed to try to to fashion this perfect human race. And when you look at a lot of what the Nazis were doing with trying to collect relics and visiting all these places around the world, some of this esotericism that the Nazis kind of took to heart, especially Himmler and some of the other people I have here to talk about, they went to Tibet, right, they took measurements of skulls and came back with scrolls and information, trying to find and trace down the lineage of the Aryan race, essentially. They actually developed I guess what you could call it, an ancestral heritage society, if I could talk, called the Ahnenerbe, which is the sort of their historical documentation, SS-driven like research group for all of this Aryan history stuff and validating like white supremacy, the Aryan race supremacy, the perfect race which was the point here, right? And so the SS, the Ahnenerbe, these groups, they have these footprints all over the world trying to find this stuff, and it's conceptualized for sure in the Indiana Jones movies, absolutely. Hellboy, all these things. That the Germans, the Nazis during World War II, were trying to find all these additional ways to win the war and bring about the Third Reich over the world, right? And prove all this stuff. And Houska Castle has a foothold in that legend and that lore because it is said by the local folklore to have been a place where they were performing occultist rituals, right? So I have some history here we'll talk about. I don't necessarily think that people need a deep, insightful history on what the SS was. I think everybody pretty much knows what they were. But anyway, let's just give you a quick one on their ruthless political military objectives. They had occult principles, they had occult practices, and most of those occult practices essentially had a lot to do with the upper echelon ranks of the SS and sort of like a brotherhood aspect when people were joining the SS. And there's some very famous pictures of like torch holding and stuff like that. And these are all part of that occult mystical thing that they had going on. And I'll read this one small passage here about the Nazi Ahnenerbe. It says it was an elite SS-driven research division focused on uncovering and validating Aryan supremacy through pseudo-historical and esoteric studies. Its scholars scoured the globe for ancient texts, sacred artifacts, and arcane rituals, hoping to rewrite history. And another thing I thought was pretty interesting is they were also trying to locate the origins of Atlantis, which I think is pretty funny because they had this whole notion that Atlantis was the mecca of the Aryan history, the Aryan race. Kind of to your point, right? That they were back in the day more advanced and that history isn't linear and that the Aryan race, fell off for all these reasons essentially here, but that there was a presence there at Houska Castle. But I just wanted to say that there is 100% hard fact, a castle that Heinrich Himmler did use very specifically for the occultist practice that he did. And that castle was, I'm going to probably butcher this name, but Wewelsburg Castle, if I could try to say it the German way. But it essentially became the spiritual and esoteric hub for the SS. And it was meant, as he said, to be the center of the new mystical Reich. They used a lot of old Germanic traditions, ideology, and mysticism, essentially. And actually, I think I'm going to pull up a picture of some of these SS meetings with the torches if you want to riff for a second.
Yeah, I just think it's incredibly interesting how a lot of people are going to listen to this and they're going to be like, you guys are just talking about conspiracy theories and you're just talking about ghost stories and you're just talking about, but it's like, to your point earlier, it's like there's a reason these oral traditions have stayed somewhat consistent since the 1200s about some of these stories that we told about the dude being lowered into the pit, about the ghost stories of the prisoners being marched across the valley below. I have a few more that I want to get into later. And then, if what we're saying is so out there and so non-believable, then why would, one of the strongest militaries of the day in 1940 believe it enough to march across the Czech Republic and set up shop there and actually investigate this stuff. So to me, all of that lended credence to it. It's like, that's why I looked into it, and I'm like, there's something to be had here. Like, maybe it's something we're missing, Maybe it's something, like I said, where they protecting something and we didn't know it was valuable, is one of my theories. But there is something here that over the last 600 years has persisted in this place.
And you can see here, this is an SS officer initiation, right? I mean, look how creepy this is with the flames. And
I can't see
all
shit
black.
in this thing.
Right. Yeah, exactly. But I think that picture like really helps capture sort of what Himmler was going for, you know, all of these things. But you know, Himmler did believe that there was a veil there that the Nazis could sort of pierce by acquiring all of this ancient history, these relics and ancient scripts, and doing these occult rituals to give them a leg up and to not only discover, you know, their history as Aryans, but to defeat the West, essentially, you know.
Yeah, for sure.
No, but let's see here. I have some history here. Just I want to contextualize this for everybody. The legend says, the local folklore, that the Nazis were interested in Houska Castle because of its alleged status as a gateway to hell. There was, again, little concrete evidence, but there is a lot. This is sort of the oral tradition that's carried on of people saying they witnessed occult experiments and occult rituals there around the bottomless pit to essentially harness some of the power that was coming out of it. Let's see here. I wanted to show too that Himmler used a lot of the SS iconography supposedly inside Houska Castle. The SS Black Sun, which is a throwback to some of the German mythological element here, which I will pull up as well. This is pretty.
Yeah, I think it's interesting while you're pulling that up too, just how much the SS mythology and everything goes back to early pagan rituals.
Exactly, that's what all this is.
If you follow those strings back together, it's there's a book I want to talk about when we're done with all this. It's called The Return of the Gods. But if you follow all this stuff back together, there's absolutely a synthesis for this stuff that tends to weirdly come modern, to where it's like, if you're willing to look at it and you know, not just, oh, those people were crazy, but really look at it, and then you pull pagan iconography together, and like we were talking about a little bit earlier, you pull Egyptian iconography together, you're like, dude, I can see where this stuff rhymes. And it's like, a lot of it becomes very like similar to each other.
Well, so here, I mean, to your point, dude, like every time you really start to look at history and some of the tropes that these groups pull into their belief systems, they are all very rooted in paganism, right? Or whatever you want to call it, mythology. So for example, right, in Wavelsburg Castle's Hall of the Dead, or the crypt, this black sun symbol, okay, was on the floor. Okay. And it was essentially a spot that they used for initiation rites for SS officers, and like super secret, like insider, you know, SS officers, probably really high up kind of thing, right? But this area inside the crypt of Wavelsburg Castle was used to commune with the spirits of SS leaders. That was one of the areas. So there is this just like super mega heavy emphasis on communing with spirits, you know, piercing that veil through ritual and practice and all these things, you know, and these themes are why you could see they were so attracted to Houska Castle. When you consider there's a fucking pit in the ground at this castle where supposedly like it's a portal to hell.
At the center of the
the center of the castle, inside the Hall of the Dead, it says too that there were 12 pillars symbolizing the elite SS leadership as a new mystical nightly round table. There's more lore, right? More lore being Arthurian.
That's a biblical number, and it's also Arthurian.
You're right. The 12 disciples, right? There's all these different things. Anyway, so the Norse mythology, sun worship, these occult practices, and sacrifices. Supposedly, right? There's no hard evidence of this, that took place at some of these places around the world that the Ahnenerbe and the SS went to sort of get to the roots of their Aryan history and to try to harness some of these, the spiritual aspect or whatever, to try to win the war. Okay, this is basically what they were doing. But I mean, there was also the concept too that going to some of these areas and sacrificing people was sort of a way of purifying the cause by giving up their most elite people as an offering to these things. So when you said there were people buried beneath the floorboards, you know, you're keeping your dead, your most elite dead there in these areas where you're performing these rituals.
At least 3, according to legend, were found while they were renovating the castle. Yeah.
Well, I mean, and let's just sit on this idea for a second, right? Like, ritualistic, you know, human sacrifice isn't, you know, unique to any one culture. It happened all the time. You know, the Aztecs are appeasing the sun god, so it'll wake up in the morning and, you know, they'll have crops and rain and all these things, and it's just like what it is. And it's sort of interesting. One of the episodes we did a while back with Luke Caverns was talking about how you would think like these human sacrifices they're doing are just sort of like the street trash or like the prisoners. But these sacrifices actually were sort of the best of the best. And one of the ways they determined that was ancient sport with, you know, using the ball with their hips and stuff like that to get it through the hoop on the side. And that's why there would be, I made the joke in that episode that back in the ancient Mesoamerican cultures, there would be no Tom Brady's, because if you were truly that good, you'd be sacrificed on top of a pyramid, right? So this notion of sacrificing your best, or a virgin sacrifice, these things, they're not new, and they are, I guess you could like look at it as like
or
the
flawless children.
Children, perfect, right? You know, that these are the best of us being sacrificed to you, right? As like, hey, this is the best thing we can offer you, and it's the ultimate form of respect, right?
Right.
I mean, aren't there? Yeah, I mean, there's I know there's like biblical aspects to that too. That I'm sure you could contextualize too.
Yeah,
on, like, some of these sacrifices.
in the Old Testament, when the children of Israel had to move into the land of Canaan, and God said to them, you know, don't be anything like the people in the land that you're going into. One of the things that the spies of the children of Israel noted was that they were giant people. They were all over like 10 foot tall. They said they're massive. They practice human sacrifice. Like, yeah, that all shows up in the Bible.
Well, and then the Old Testament too. There was, forgive me for forgetting who it was, but was called upon to sacrifice his son, right? And then God stopped him.
So that's a very interesting point that you bring up. But a lot of biblical scholars, because the Lord stopped that and said, "I wanted to know that you were willing to do that." Basically, and that was Abraham and Isaac. Kind of represents God was reaching out to see, like, would a man be willing to do the thing that I'm going to do with Jesus later on. And then to see that mankind was indeed, or at least Abraham was willing to do that. But again, the difference in the biblical sense versus the pagan sense is that God stopped it and said, no, I'm not going to allow you to do this. Right. Yeah. And so that's, again, drawing distinctions between Christianity and paganism. Yeah, for sure.
Right. Yeah.
It shows up in there too.
No, I just found it really interesting. I wondered when I started reading about this, and obviously in Indiana Jones, the Nazis are going after the Holy Grail, and that is true. The Nazis were trying to find the Holy Grail, and in the movie they did find the Holy Grail, and then they found a Crusader knight that had been living forever inside apparently Petra in Jordan.
He chose
poorly. Yes, you chose wisely.
That's the cup of a carpenter.
Dude, exactly, dude. But so I made a short list of the different sorts of mythological things and relics that they were going after. And this is a short list, right?
The Nazis?
The Nazis, yeah.
Oh, okay.
The Holy Grail was one of them. The Spear of Destiny. Any
Yeah.
sort of ancient Aryan texts and relics, which is why they went to Tibet. And interestingly enough, they brought back skulls from Tibet as evidence of the Aryan race, which is pretty weird when you consider what the Tibetans look like. The Ark of the Covenant, right? And then Thor's hammer, Mjolnir. Right, which is a symbol of power from Norse mythology and also exists in Germanic mythology. But what I did find interesting is that the Nazis did say that they discovered the Spear of Destiny and that they held on to it and had it for a short period of time, although that's not confirmed. And it said that they claimed it to be the original from a museum in Vienna. But they were obviously looking for it. And the Spear of Destiny is the spirit I believe that pierced Christ on the cross, and it is essentially what killed him, right? What killed him? Like he wouldn't have died anyway from.
No,
Correct me where I'm wrong.
That's very wrong. Oh, yeah, so the Spear of Destiny is it is said in Jesus' death is recorded in Matthew, Mark, and John, and it's said in there that after Jesus gives his final words, "Lord, into your hand that I commit my spirit," and then he gives up the ghost, and then there's an earthquake that happens. The sun is blotted out. The veil of the temple in nearby Jerusalem is torn from top to bottom, which is very important, not bottom to top, top to bottom. Which is where the Ark of the Covenant was said to have been kept at the time, because that's where the Spirit of God was supposed to reign. One of the Roman guards reached up and pierced his side with the spear to ensure that he was indeed dead. And it's very important because Jesus' death follows a series of prophecies from the Old Testament. One is that none of his bones would ever be broken. So we know that the thief on his left and the thief on his right both had their bones broken, but they never did break Jesus's legs in order to hasten his death. So that's very important. And then he did indeed die of natural causes, to where it said, and he gave up the ghost. Like he slumped forward and died. And then they pierced his side, and it was said in scripture that both water and blood flowed from him. And one of the reasons that's very important as a medical provider to say is that the longer that you go suffocating, and Jesus most likely would have died from what's called a massive cardiac infarction, because as you're being crucified, you're being suspended by your arms, and your chest is sitting down on top of your heart and your lungs, and you can't take a full breath. So as the pulmonary system is trying to pump blood, or the heart is trying to pump blood through the lungs are literally being closed off lobe by lobe, and all of those places where the lungs are adhesing together because they're no longer getting blood, the blood is going to start separating from the plasma, and then you're going to have
so there's actual
like
medical
clear frothy fluid in your chest cavity. So
got you.
That's
I just want to show this.
It was so important that when they pierced his side and water and blood came out, what they were basically looking at was they probably pierced his lung, and all of that plasma that had separated from the blood inside of his lung flowed out and was evacuated. And so, yeah, there's some very medical reasons that the Bible gave us that that evidence as to exactly how he died.
Got you. I was looking at some of these pictures, these SS initiation rituals, and I found this one to be really interesting. It looks like the thumbnail for a YouTube video, but I mean, we talk about some of the things that were described coming out of the hole at Castle Houska, the chimera, the blending of animal and man, to different things, right? You can see these look like deer ears, and there's obviously antlers, right? So these are SS officers with some sort of pagan symbol here. I'm not sure what this one means, but I just saw it.
Fall Out Boy music video, dude.
What's that?
Are you more than I bargained for yet? That was that dude in the in the Fall Out Boy music video. Get that reference, guys. Go back and find that.
Oh, okay. But no, I just was saying, like, here it is. It's, again, exactly why they would be intrigued and want to go to a place like a Castle Houska. But yeah, the Nazis seized a spear, and they displayed it at Hofburg Palace in Vienna, and they claimed that it was the holy spear that pierced the side of Christ. But obviously, there's no way of knowing that. But yeah, Himmler definitely was the leader of all of this stuff, and his main focus was essentially on discovering all of this occult paganism type thing, and he used a lot of different iconography and ideologies to sort of paint this picture of the Aryan race. And I pulled a clip or a quote up from Himmler. It says, "What's that? Oh, a clip? Yeah, no." We will create our own myth. The myth is the myth of blood, that belief that the divine nature of the Nordic blood was of godlike essence. And that's a quote from Himmler. And it says he is the Reichsführer of the SS and leader of the Ahnenerbe as well. And essentially, he had a lifelong fascination with German paganism and astrology as well, which is really interesting because Hitler, for a while there, kept around an astrologist before he essentially got sick of him, everything I read said. And the later half of the war sort of like wanted nothing to do with astrology, which I think is really interesting. But that Himmler also was primary in transforming Wewelsburg Castle into the quote-unquote spiritual center of the SS, infusing its rituals and symbolism with the occult beliefs he harbored, and used the Ahnenerbe to sponsor expeditions, historical research, and esoteric studies to create a mystic, racially pure ideology, which is fucking nuts, bro.
Well, there's a theory that I've heard, and I don't lend much credence to it. But there is a theory out there to suggest that Hitler was not actually the evil genius that everybody made him out to be, but that he was more of a figurehead and a public speaker. And,
right.
And he was more or less just used because of his ability to public speak and persuade, and that he wasn't actually the one that was the evil genius behind everything that the Reich did. And that's
definitely
why
not.
In the end, you know, when it really came down to it, you know, he hid in the bunker and was trying to get out for his own life. You know, and I don't, like I said, I don't necessarily lend credence to it, but I've read it and I find it to be intriguing. To
your point, right? Like I was saying, Hitler lost his like fascination with astrology eventually,
right.
But Rudolf Hess says here, some of these notes I took, that he was Hitler's deputy Führer, so basically 2IC, second in charge, that his role essentially was political, but that he had a deep-rooted fascination with astrology his entire life. The occult, it says here, alternative medicine, and often consulted astrologers and mystics for his personal guidance, right? So it's sort of, when you look at it here, you give credence to the fact that Hitler sort of lost his novelty with astrology, that Hess may have been the one here with Himmler sort of driving all of this stuff more than anything. And to your point, perhaps he was more of a figurehead. And there's probably going to be somebody who is way more versed in all of this historically going to come at us in the comments. Like we said, you know, this is...
it's kind of interesting to add to that, too. I can't remember her name off the top of my head, but he had that wench that hung out with Hitler and then also hung out with Mussolini and was basically passed around between three of the biggest figureheads at the time. And it was like, what was her role in all of that? And why was she there,
right?
You know, and it's like, why was she passed between the three of them like a whore? It's all very interesting to go back and look at, but then again, history is also written by the victors, and
absolutely,
you know, both the Soviet Union and the United States had a large vested interest in post World War II setting the narrative of everything that happened, and so it's like we're probably never going to know all the deep dark secrets, because
there's so much that was destroyed too.
I know. I was just going to say, one of the theories that I had is, if, you know, Himmler was so interested in Houska Castle and a giant bottomless pit that's down below there, and he occupied it for a time, like, you know, is there a possibility, and especially being buried under all this limestone that we can't penetrate with radar, which we haven't even talked about the limestone yet, which is a good thing to think about. It's like, are there Nazi treasures buried down there because of the way
they would never tell us, I bet, if that shit was down there, bro.
No, of course they wouldn't. But I just find it to be an interesting causeway between those theories, where it's like we have a lot of Nazi treasures that we're trying to look for that have been disappeared over the years. And if they were buried at the base of a mountain covered completely by limestone, which is electromagnetic, you would never know that shit was down there, and you wouldn't never be able to get down to it. So it's very potentially it's interesting to think about. But since we're on the point now, there's a huge correlation. And again, correlation and causation, right? But there's a huge correlation between limestone, electromagnetic stone.
Well, I don't want to jump there yet. I'm sorry. I have some more stuff on the Nazis here, because I have trust me, I have a whole piece on the limestone and some of the other stuff. I don't want to jump around too much.
My bad.
No, you're good. I was just going to say, there's another person that doesn't get brought up a lot, but through some of the stuff I was looking into, the last thing I'll say about Hess, apparently he took a flight to Britain in 1941 that lost him a lot of credibility with the Nazi hierarchy, but his entire motivation for going was purely because of astrological predictions that were given to him. So it's kind of interesting, right? And if you remember too, the beginning of the war, the Nazis felt like the Brits and them had that Aryan heritage in common, and made statements about not wanting to go to war with Great Britain because of those ties. And also there were also legitimate family ties between Germany and Britain, just as pretty much everybody in Europe does, but those were more prominent in that era, right? But the last one I'll talk about is a person named Karl Maria Villagut, or Weisthor. There's like two different names it was given me. So, but he was an SS officer and occultist who served as a key advisor to Himmler. And this is the part that I found to be really interesting. It says he was involved in shaping the SS's rituals and symbolism, but was often referred to as Himmler's Rasputin. And
I was going to say, that almost sounds like he was a priest. If you're saying he was in charge of shaping
that was his literal nickname.
Rituals. Yeah.
Hitler's,
that's what a priest does.
Exactly. Yeah. Himmler's Rasputin. And when you look at who Rasputin was, right, he's sort of this like spiritual leader.
We could do a whole episode on that.
Oh,
guy
I know.
alone.
It's fucking
That's
nuts.
Creepy as hell.
Right.
Yeah.
It is. So just to give you guys, without going too far down the rabbit hole of Rasputin, but like the fact that somebody has that nickname in the SS of Himmler's Rasputin just goes to show you the sort of links and dedication these people had to these activities, right? And some of those activities to the point I was trying to make here, the Nazis had an interest, it says, in psychic phenomena, telepathy, and remote viewing. Okay, so I want to make the point here: the Nazis weren't the only people who were using these sorts of things. The Americans were doing the same shit. They made a movie about the Americans using people for the men who stare at goats. Exactly, portrays that very much, and that there's actually some unclassified documents from the CIA that discuss a lot of these programs that they had for remote viewing, interdimensionality, creating your own reality, all of these things. The Soviet were trying to use them to spy on the Soviets, and the Soviets were doing the same thing back to the Americans.
Yeah. When it comes to that, I don't want to draw a link between remote viewing and the Bible to say that like it's on the same level. But what I do want to bring up is that the language used to describe the two, when it says like John the Revelator was exiled to the island of Patmos, and then it says, and then a vision came upon him, and he starts talking about these things that he's seeing outside of space and outside of time, and that is to say somewhere that he was not and in a time that he was not, is very similar to the things that the Nazis or the men who stare at goats were absolutely trying to access and to be able to. So there are lots of correlations to be drawn between ancient texts like the Bible, where we talk about prophecy, where people are seeing things in places that they are not and in times that they are not. So yeah, for sure.
No, absolutely. These are a lot of these tropes, they exist no matter what culture you look at, you know.
The Native Americans have their spirit walks, like you'll see it.
Oh
all
yeah,
over
perfect.
The place.
That's a perfect example. Yeah, good job, man.
Yeah.
So it says consider these things carried over after the end of World War II as well. A lot of these things, obviously, we know Operation Paperclip, where the United States essentially took all these Nazi scientists and plugged them into the American space and nuclear programs. Which is so wild to think about, because how far ahead the Germans were. We were just talking about hypersonics the other day before that episode got corrupted. Not you and me, but me and Marcus. But some of the speeds that the Germans were able to obtain during this period of time, their scientists, were actually hypersonic speeds. Now, they weren't maneuverable, and they weren't things that they could harness to that degree, right? But these rockets and things that they were building, I mean, the Germans were just so innovative.
Well, yeah, and that brings up another great point too, because it's like you again, going back to the fact that we're smarter now than we ever have been, or we're able to create something, like Elon Musk going to Mars, or us walking on the moon in the 1960s. Like, again, if you go back into ancient text, and again, it also kind of weirdly ties into remote viewing or seeing prophecies. Like the prophet Ezekiel said that he saw, as it were, a vision from heaven, and he saw a wheel inside of a wheel, and the big wheel moved by faith and the small wheel moved by the grace of God, and we sing Sunday school songs about it now, but it's like, what was Ezekiel seeing? It's like he can't maybe necessarily describe, because in his language it doesn't exist, but what was he seeing?
That's a great point.
It sounds like something to me that it could have been a visual metaphor, and that's what a lot of theologians will tell you. It's like, oh, it was a visual metaphor. If you talk to ancient astronaut theorists, they'll be like, oh, it was a spaceship.
Yeah.
You know, but still, what I'm talking about is just the correlation of the language coming together to be like, sure, these people were seeing something that maybe they necessarily couldn't describe. And I've made the correlation too, where it says, you know, John the Revelator was talking about chimera coming out of the middle of the earth and flying around. I've always wondered if you have a creature that has the body that's bigger than a war horse and it has the head of a man, but it has a tail of a scorpion and wings. I'm like, is he trying to talk about a helicopter? You know, it's like, is he trying to describe something that he doesn't necessarily know? And then he says it torments mankind. You know, it's like, was he trying to describe like what would be like a modern day Apache helicopter, like a longbow flying around, and he can see a dude's head floating in it, and he's like, I don't know what that is though, so I'm just describing to you the dimensions of it and like kind of what it looks like. It's always made me wonder. Those kind of things always made me wonder.
It's very true, because we're, again, with this whole oral tradition we're talking about here, we are at the will of these people trying to describe these things from thousands of years ago, and we all are very familiar with how much the game of telephone loses context within 10 people you play this game. You have no idea, which is why it gives us license here to sit and discuss these things and give speculation and talk about it, because we just don't know. None of this is written down. There's not a book somebody wrote during this time and said, hey, here it is. Here's the entire evidential work of the Nazis at Houska Castle with every literal thing they ever did there.
Right. And I just want to throw out to anybody that watches us and would be of the Christian persuasion, like, I am by no means knocking the historicity or the veracity of the Bible. I fully 100% believe that the Bible is the inerrant, infallible word of God, and it is completely true to itself, and I have nothing but faith in it. What I'm doing is, I believe that God made me mind, body, and spirit, and so when I read things, it makes me naturally curious. And so I read other things, and I see that, and I go, oh, maybe there's correlations there that I just don't understand. Right? That's not to say that I don't believe the word of God. I'm just a curious person, and I believe that God made me, you know, it's like I should mentally, because if I don't study this stuff and then know how to talk about it, then the very first time that you meet somebody that is like, no, you know, it's like comes at you from, you know, it's like, look at this document, look at, you know, the Quran, look at the, you know, like, or whatever, and they come at you. It's like, if you've never studied through this stuff and actually read through it, then you don't have a leg to stand on to be able to talk. Then all you have is like, childlike faith, and then you look like an idiot, right? So I did want to say that.
Yeah,
I believe the word of God is complete in and of itself, but I think this stuff is interesting to look at.
Yeah. One of the most famous people that the Nazis that Operation Paperclip brought over was Werner von Braun, right? And you know, essentially the entire American space program was conceptually put together intellectually, intelligently by Nazis, basically, that had been brought over to the United States. But Werner von Braun also had a very strong belief in the esoteric and the mystical side of things. And I think that's very interesting because, and this is a thing we talk about in this podcast quite often, is that these very famous people who have these sort of knowledge about the stars and rocketry and physics and sort of these things, physics is said to be, you know, the language of God that we're figuring out. Essentially, that's the thing you'll hear people describe it as. And you look at additional people, like another person we talked about in this podcast, like Jack Parsons, right, who's said to have downloaded information from his practices and rituals he did that put him in the path of beings and voices that gave him the math he needed to be the father of American rocketry. And then you consider, too, the company that Jack Parsons kept was Aleister Crowley and then L. Ron Hubbard. These people out in the desert performing sex magic and these rituals, which are occult rituals, and they're downloading this information that has to do, you know, it's coming from the other side, it's coming from somebody on the other side, but it's giving them this hidden knowledge, which is the whole point of what the Nazis were trying to do with occultism, is to discover hidden knowledge in places like Houska, to basically give them a leg up on everything and to learn and understand and act upon that information they're being given.
Yeah, that brings up a really excellent point for me, because going again back to the Old Testament, I'll just say this: if you don't believe that there's something beyond the physical that is flesh and blood mankind, then you haven't even read the Bible, because I'm going to bring up two instances in the Bible that would tell me that demonology, spirituality, paranormal, something beyond us, flesh and blood, absolutely exists, and there is another side to this realm, whether you're mathematical and you want to say that it's the fourth or the fifth dimension that we don't understand. You want to talk about ufology and say that, like, we're talking about alternate dimensions, or I believe spiritually there's the spiritual aside from the physical, like whatever you want to call it, there is something out there that exists. So if there wasn't, then when God told the children of Israel to go into the land of Canaan, but do not practice anything that they practice over there, to include, and he specifically brings up divination, the talking to the dead and consulting with spirits. If there was nothing to it, then why would God have told the children of Israel, don't have anything to do with it, don't do that, don't go into that? And then there's another story where King Saul was the king before King David, which most people would know from the Old Testament, wants to consult the prophet Samuel, who had died by this point, and so he goes to a witch, a divinator, to bring up Samuel's ghost and to talk to him. And she performs the ritual. The problem is, in the ritual, it says in the scripture that Samuel's actual ghost comes back, and it freaks the witch out. And she looks at King Saul and she says, "What have you had me do?" And she freaks out and she leaves. And then King Saul actually talks to the ghost of Samuel the prophet, who had died by that point. And so there are, like, again, that's in the Bible, that happened. And so it's like there are points to the Bible. And again, Jesus Christ, it says he died, was buried, went to hell, and then was raised again and came back. It says that Jesus Christ actually met with the devil, who took him into the high places, and offered him the entire world if he would only bow down and worship Jesus. So there are several places in the Bible where it doesn't just suggest that the spiritual exists. It goes, these things happened. Jesus drove demons out of a young man and sent them into a herd of pigs that killed themselves. So it's like, we know that there are spiritual beings out there, that there are quote unquote ghosts or poltergeists, whether you want to believe that they're the dead of, I don't necessarily believe that they're the dead of the dead souls of human beings, because scripture says to be absent from the body is to be present with Christ. Our soul goes to where God designed it to go, but there are spiritual beings out there that can and do interact with the physical realm. The Bible absolutely says that this is true. And then, like I said, even in a few points, Samuel's ghost himself actually comes back. Jesus, on the Mount of Transfiguration, met with two prophets, and it was the disciple Peter that suggests that it was possibly Elijah, and we think maybe Enoch. The Bible's ambiguous about who they were, but definitely says that Jesus met with two souls that were human beings that God had allowed to come back and meet with him and tell Jesus how he was going to die. So it's like we see these things. It absolutely happens in Scripture. So to say that the Nazis it's all just conspiracy theory, it's all just bunk. No, this stuff happens. It's how we look at it and how we describe it, right? Or maybe what the spiritual laws are to it that allows things to move between the realms or the dimensions or the veils or whatever you want to call it. That's the stuff that we don't understand.
Yeah, and that's exactly why I say, like, when I give these explanations, right, like try to understand the motivation to build this castle and offer up these logical or practical explanations for why he did that. I don't say that to cast off the paranormal, supernatural side of this and say that that's not the reason at all. There's not, I'm not saying that at all. I don't know. And in my belief, the line of belief, I think that's, totally plausible that he did that because there was something going on there. And what else could you do? Right. I mean, like, I don't know, man. If there was a ghost in my house, I mean, it wouldn't be beyond the conceptual to think that I might go get my gun. I don't know. It's just something. Right. You're going to do what's going to make you feel safe in the moment, I guess, is kind of the point I'm trying to make here.
I've seen shadow beings and light beings, and I can tell you right now, like those are other stories entirely. But like I've had paranormal experiences,
Right.
and like I can tell you that I don't understand them. Like when you come through them on the other side, you're like, there's nothing that explains that what I just went through.
Yeah, exactly.
That wasn't physical.
Right. No, yeah, absolutely. One of the last ones I want to mention here before we jump into some of the like the limestone that you were talking about here is the Thule Society and Aryan mysticism. So I don't know if it's Tool or Thule, whatever. Thule Society, Thule. Geez, the Thule Society preceded and influenced Nazi ideology and espoused beliefs in Aryan supremacy.
We have a Senator Thule right now.
We do.
That's very interesting.
Well, then there's the Air Force Base Thule, that's how it's pronounced, in Greenland, which could be the Thule Society or the Tula Society. I don't know how they're pronouncing this with the German here, but essentially Aryan supremacy, ancient Germanic mysticism, and nationalist aims, right? But the Thule Society was founded by Rudolf von Subbotendorf in 1918. So this precedes World War II and the Nazis. This is 1918, right? So this is, but anyway, so his
After Armistice.
Right, exactly. Right after World War I, right, which Hitler fought in. The practices were rooted in the blend of theosophy, astrology, alchemy, Sufi mysticism. And it says that Subbotendorf studied astrological and esoteric teachings in Turkey, where he delved into mystical Islamic Sufi practices and Rosicrucianism. And I say this because how interesting is it that Rosicrucianism always pops its little fucking head up across history as this sort of like ambassador of hidden knowledge, right? It's everywhere. And in Turkey, okay, there is a site was recently discovered called Darren Kuyu, and one of the and I almost included it in the list, but I just want to say that one of the ancient folklore legends around Darren Kuyu is that it was also built to protect people from a darkness beneath. Right. Mm-hmm. So there is this trope that goes back throughout human history of construction and building things that, protect humanity from an unknown, dark, black force, essentially. Right.
Well, it's very interesting, too, to tie that into if you looked like at Thomas Aquinas or any of the great Western theologians, they often are spending a long time. C.S. Lewis talked against it quite a bit too, bringing it very, very modern, and that's against Gnosticism, this idea that there is a hidden knowledge, because Jesus Christ talked about it quite a bit. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Like, there is nothing that you have to study beyond me. Like, none come to the Father but by me. So Gnosticism is the study of sacred knowledge. Like, if I can just know a little deeper or peel behind the onion, I'm very much paraphrasing, but the idea is that I can find some sacred knowledge that will elevate me and put me on a different plane, above the rest of humanity, and then I will be the sacred bearer of the secret hidden truth, as it were, So it's very interesting. And then if you look back into again, the Old Testament, when you talk about Satan himself, he says, I will ascend to the throne and I will make myself like the Father. And the very first temptation that Lucifer or Satan, disguised as a serpent, ever gives to mankind is, did God really say that you couldn't eat of the truth? No, because he knows that in the day that you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like gods, knowing right from wrong. Right. So the very first sin of mankind is the seeking of, some say it's pride, because it's like, I will be like God, like Satan was. And then other theologians argue, no, it was the seeking of deeper knowledge, of something sacred,
hidden knowledge
was keeping hidden from man.
Yeah.
So yeah. So everything that you just said, like, you can find correlations to it in Scripture itself.
And that is it, though, right? That whole thing, like, this all comes together in this search for secret knowledge, right?
We're the same men.
We are the same men throughout history, exactly. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Think of all of these secret societies that we have had throughout history: the SS, right? Masonry, all these different groups, the Illuminati, the Rosicrucians. What is the ultimate goal here? Is you're hoarding secret knowledge. There you have secret handshakes and secret rites and secret initiations.
Knights of the Golden Circle.
Right.
Yep.
The Knights of the Golden Circle, which we'll do an episode on once you're officially back.
Oh, yes.
But, and that's what this is. It is this pure and total search for hidden knowledge, and it exists and is the root of so much evil throughout history and so much mystery that enshrouds a lot of what we do. And when you really get into a lot of the people that are the leaders that have marched humanity through time towards modern progress, right? Like kind of your whole spiel about like the linear progression of humanity, right? These people all belong to these certain organizations, if you could call them that, Masons, Rosicrucians, right? They all belong to these groups that harbor secret knowledge and seek hidden knowledge as a functioning apparatus, right? It is a forcing function, to be in these groups that you will seek hidden knowledge. And so there is this theme, you could say. The theme might even be too light of a word. I would almost say it's a compulsion in these groups. Like I said, a forcing mechanism for you to do this, to being part of these groups. That is the point.
And I don't necessarily think that there's, I got to be really careful how I say this.
Okay.
Ooh. I don't necessarily
Just
think that there's not something beyond this physical realm for us to know. I think there is.
Say that again?
I don't think that there's. I think that there is more beyond this physical world for us to know, because God made us eternal. He put a soul inside of us that is eternal. But it's like Jesus Christ said, unless you become like one of these little ones, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. And so the idea in that scripture is to have childlike faith. And then elsewhere in scripture, it says, faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things unseen. So the idea is that, you may not be able to understand everything. You don't know everything. But when God says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, you trust him. There is something beyond the veil of death that we don't know and we can't understand. But it's that we have faith in God and we trust him. And then all things will be revealed in time when we get over there. It's a biological truth. Neuroscientists know that human beings only use 10 to 12% of the cranial space that we have. 90 to 88% of the brain is untapped at most time. At almost all time throughout human life. It doesn't matter how much information you download, and it doesn't matter like how many memories that you store. Like that much of your brain, of your neuroplasticity, is not being used, is not being like energized with electricity as the neurons fire. So is there a part of our brain that Adam and Eve had when God came down and walked with them every single day, that it takes that much of the brain to comprehend God in his physical form? I don't know. Right. But that's kind of the point, and why I said I got to be careful when I say this, because it's not the ascertainment or the attribution of hidden knowledge that brings you close to God. It's actually the trust and the humility of recognizing that you don't know everything and you never can know everything, but that you trust God when he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So yeah, it's all this stuff that we're talking about. I don't mean to keep taking it back to theology. I'm just kind of letting my brain free wander here at 11 o'clock at night. And it's like, as we're talking about this stuff, it kind of reminds me of the light side and the dark side of the force. Whereas like you have the Sith that says, this is a stupid analogy, but you have the Sith that says like, if you allow yourself into the dark side of the force, you'll have, knowledge that you can't, and power that it will give you. But then the light side of the force is like, no, that's not for you. Don't venture into that. Right? Like keep yourself over here. And I do think that Steven Spielberg was kind of getting into something when he recognized that.
Oh, there are absolute Christian overtones in Star Wars.
Yeah, the Bible
and Nazi
makes
overtones.
The exact same
undertones.
Well, yeah,
stormtroopers. No, for real.
But yeah, all of that. It just I'm just free.
Vader means father in German, right?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. So it's very interesting stuff. But let's get over and talk about the limestone, because I find I have some points that I want to make about this. But the correlation here is insane.
I think it sounded like when you were talking before, you were kind of going to go the same direction that I was mentioning with limestone. Essentially, in the paranormal researcher community, the presence of limestone is basically known to contribute to the experiences that people have when it's in their vicinity. Yes. And I read online that it's not necessarily the limestone itself, but the presence of quartz within the limestone that's known to increase the EMF, the electromagnetic frequencies around there. And to the paranormal
so it does
researcher,
conduct electricity.
Right. So, and one thing I wrote here in my notes is that to me, it seems like it's sort of a chicken and the egg situation, as like the questions that come to my mind is it the increased EMF activity that creates supernatural experiences, or is it the supernatural experience that's going on there that elevates the EMF around it to allow it to pierce the veil into our side? Is that like chicken and egg question?
Yeah, it's a really good point. So I'm going to bring up 2 points that I know just from some of the stuff that I've studied. We know that there's an absolute correlation that exists there. One that would represent, we don't understand, like, is it because the limestone's there? The field at Gettysburg is one of the most paranormal places in the world, and there are both sentient and non-sentient paranormal activity that happens there almost constantly. The field at Gettysburg is underlined with limestone like crazy. And when they go back and they look there and they dig into the earth, like, it is absolutely there. Go elsewhere in the world, the pyramids are built almost entirely out of a layer of limestone underneath with granite on top. Now, that's a conducting stone underneath with a non-conducting stone granite on top of it. And the pyramids also have lots of paranormal activity that take place in and around it. And the reason I bring those two together as examples is because the limestone that was cut for the pyramids was brought from forever away to be built there in that area. It wasn't like they mined it out of the sand to put it there. So they brought that there for some reason that the ancient men or the aliens, whatever you believe, like understood that it was important. And then another example of ancient stones that were quarried and brought are the stones at Stonehenge.
Yep.
Which also have limestone in them and were brought and quarried from hundreds of
Central
kilometers
and South
away.
America too. Tenochtitlan.
Machu Picchu. How the hell they got those up on that precipice?
Sure. Yeah.
So we know that ancient mankind built with those stones for a reason, and we know that paranormal activity follows those stones for a reason. And then we also see places in the world where we didn't know that there was limestone there, and yet there's tons of paranormal activity.
Yeah.
So I say all that to say, I don't know, chicken and the egg, but at some point we knew. We knew that there's a certain type of energy that goes with that material, building material.
I'll jump back real quick to your point about the pyramids and like limestone and granite. And I'm going to pull something out of a Graham Hancock book, Fingerprints of the Gods, that I read a long time ago. Essentially, he describes the use of like granite as like an insulator for stone, like limestone, and that he asked people to think of it in the way that you would a cord, an electrical cord, that there is uses the current on the inside and it is protected by another layer on the outside, and that essentially it's the granite exists to protect the conductor, and that's sort of his.
It's an insulator and a conductor. That's what I was trying to get at, but I skipped over it like really fast.
That's exactly what you're talking about.
The rubber and the copper core.
Exactly.
That's what
the
you're
granite exists to protect the conductor, and that's sort of the way that I think it's a very succinct and cogent way to get people to understand. Is kind of like the point there. But one of the things I wanted to say is that a lot of
could do a whole episode on the pyramids alone.
You could. Oh yeah, people have.
That's a whole thing, dude. That fascinates me.
Well, you talk to a lot of paranormal researchers that are aware of like limestone, its presence, and that these terrible things that happen. One of the things that they call these hauntings at Gettysburg and other famous places where tragedies happen is they call them like imprint hauntings, and that essentially it's not necessarily not necessarily a conscious, right, for lack of a better term, ghost that's just haunting the area, but it's essentially the imprint of somebody who died, and perhaps they died unexpectedly in a violent way, and they're just going through the motions because there was all this emotion or whatever that's been imprinted and is being held within the stone. So that's why you witness, pipers and marching troops, and you hear cannon fire, and you can see a swaying lantern from men moving through the trees, and that these are essentially captured and trapped within the memory of the natural elements of the land, and that's limestone plays a role in it. There is sort of one of the prevailing theories.
I don't even think it's that hard to understand. I mean, if you go back and you look at cassette tapes or video cassettes,
record players
for you 90s kids, basically, record players. I can't remember what the vinyl, what it's made out of, but cassette tapes and video cassettes was a better example for what I'm talking about, because they basically use electromagnetic tape to run an image and a sound over, and then they know that it can contain it, and then when you run it back under a magnet, it projects an image onto a screen. So if you have a giant slab, again talking to Gettysburg specifically, and you have a lot of let me make another point as I get off of this, but you have a lot of electromagnetic energy that's imprinted on top of it. I mean, basically you have a giant geological cassette tape. Like, you really do. It's like we understand it on a micro level.
That's a great way to explain it.
And then two things that happened. There was a physician in the 1800s, and forgive me that I can't remember his name, but he was trying to measure, basically explain the existence of a human soul, and he was measuring human bodies at the point that they died.
Oh, is this
and he
I don't want to
able
steal your thunder.
No, but he was able to significantly measure by the time that he subtracted the fact that they evacuated their bowels and drained their bladder. He was able to measure a micro amount of weight that left the human body that was unaccounted for.
27 grams, right?
It was something close to that. It was very, very close to that. Okay, so you want to say, oh, that's freaking bunk, like whatever, 18th century or 19th century technology. Okay, there was a neuroscientist here in the early 2000s that was also measuring brains at the point of expiration, and what he found was there was a micro blast of electromagnetic energy that basically runs through the human brain, almost like a camera monofilament that releases and sends electromagnetic energy through all of the cells of the human body by virtue of going through the neurons. Now, it's the same process that causes the human body to evacuate its bowels and release its bladder, and then all of the human processes come to, basically come to stop. But the reason I want to talk about that biologically is because, going back to, if you have a bed of limestone and then you have 600,000 Americans that are releasing microcosms of electromagnetic energy from their bodies all at once and by the hundreds of thousands, then again, I go back to, you have a cassette tape and an electromagnetic film that lays information on top of it. You're talking about the same chemical processes that we use to imprint back in the day, to imprint stills on silver tin, and the same thing that we use to imprint image and sound on cassette tapes that are electromagnetic films. So it's not that far to say we're just looking at it and we're like, oh, that's ghost, we can't understand it. But it's like, no, I can understand the chemical processes that are happening. And again, some of them are sentient. People have had conversations with ghosts that they talk about. Now, you also have to, is it confirmation bias? People go to Gettysburg and expect to see ghosts. Like, sure. Okay. But all of that being said,
you see what you want to see, kind of thing.
Right. And that always happens. That always happens. But also, what I'm trying to get at is, there is a place where, if you are willing to not look at scientific evidence through confirmation bias, and I'm especially talking to my Christians out there, where it's like, yeah, I can explain that God, and you're like, come on, man, like actually take a second and like think,
right,
read the book. But if you're willing to actually look at it and go where the scientific evidence leads you, then you might be interested in the theories and the solutions that you come back with.
Yeah.
I'm just saying.
And to your point, like, to stick with the science, right? Like large amounts of EMF, right, detected can cause people to hallucinate, you know, and there is some of the speculation on Houska Castle is that it was like a mass hysteria event or like a shared mass hallucination, because of potentially the elevated level of limestone that was there and present. But some of the things that an elevated level of EMF can make you feel are unease, paranoia, and like I said, they can cause hallucinations, you know. So perhaps this is an explanation for what happened there, the presence of limestone. And then you have to consider too that Castle Houska itself is built with literally the limestone that's in that area, right? So it's not this, you have, you know, the castle, now you're not just standing on it, but now you're surrounded by the limestone walls, right?
Literally like 4 tuning forks that are built to aim it down toward the middle of the hole too, because we looked at the
great
architecture of it.
It's like concentrating all of the power, you know,
like the antlion hole.
Yeah, sure. There you go. Well, and then
Can
too,
we,
go
ahead.
Oh, I was just going to bring up the foul smells that people said that they smelled, trying to add some like scientific evidence into this. But if what were you going to talk about the limestone still, or?
Well, no, but the smells is a great segue into more neurobiology, and
that's exactly
people. We know that the sense of smell is the strongest recall of memory. You smell a thing and you're instantly right. Like, I'm 8 years old, my mom's cooking apple pie or whatever that it is. So your cranial nerves,
emotional
like,
response to that smell.
Olfactory, optic, ocular, motor. It's cranial nerve either 4 or 5 that goes straight from your nose straight through your brain, and it passes through the limbic system, which is your emotional center, and then it touches the center of your brain, the hippocampus, where the memories are. And so there's a reason that your nose triggers all that stuff. It can make you feel something, and it can make you remember something because it's stimulating those parts of your brain before anything else does. And if your brain is being manipulated by EMF, which electromagnetic waves, remember your brain runs on chemical changes that cause the neurons to fire, and you're getting micro bits of electricity that are running through your brain. If it's stimulating those sections of your brain, your limbic system can stimulate your cranial nerves too. And so it's like you're feeling something, and so all of a sudden you start smelling something that's associated with what you're feeling. Your brain is one giant nerve. We still, for as much as we understand about it, there's still things that we can't say. We don't know why it works the way that it works.
Yeah. No, you definitely know more about the medical side than I do. But kind of one of the points I was going to make with the foul smells is, there are natural gases as well that can cause hallucinations and give some of the same feelings that a raise and EMF can make you feel. Some of those are senses of dread, confusion, and which would lead to fear, anxiety, all of these things. And when you consider the fact that, like, maybe in today you're like, oh, well, I smell something funky. I'm out in the middle of the woods. Perhaps I'm smelling some sort of natural gas. I started to get these feelings, right? We can conceptualize it now and say, oh, well, maybe I should get out of the area because I'm just experiencing something that's happening to me, right? And that's what's causing all of this. But if you're a medieval peasant in this area, right, what are you going to attribute it to? Not to the science, that's for sure. You're going to attribute it to some sort of spiritual or your pagan thought processes and roots, or your Christian thought processes and roots is some sort of evil. It's the devil, sorts of these things. And some of the more common, looked up some of the more common gases that exist around that cause these things.
Sulfur.
So I was just going to say carbon dioxide, methane, sulfur, nitrous oxide, and hydrogen sulfide, right? So hydrogen sulfide has a rotten egg smell like sulfur, which is associated with hell, right? Additionally, all of these gases, they cause confusion, dizziness, paranoia, and anxiety, which can all lead to fear, right? So when you compound the fact that perhaps there is an elevated level of EMF in the area, and that can cause all of these other sorts of things, confusion, dizziness, paranoia, fear, then with the presence potentially of hydrogen sulfide gas, right? Because of these nasty foul odors that people were describing that come out of the chasm and in the area, you have quite a cocktail of things, of natural processes that can have an impact on your psyche and the way you're perceiving what's going on around you. If you're, again, to my point, if you're a medieval peasant and you're smelling sulfur, and you associate, the fire and brimstone with hell, right?
That's what it was. I was just looking it up. I was trying to look up so I'm going to look up what brimstone actually is.
Right. If you associate these things, right, your initial thoughts may be evil, right? And you're feeling these things. You're feeling the fear. You're feeling the confusion. You're feeling dizzy, so you don't feel like yourself. Perhaps
that's also
you think,
sulfur.
Right. Well, there you go. So you think something's, some sort of evil spirit is acting upon you, when in reality, it's just a natural process that you're going through because you've been exposed to high levels of EMF and some sort of natural gas that you're now inhaling and is working its way through your body. And
well,
again,
what was the other one you said? You said carbon dioxide, right?
Yep, methane, nitrous oxide, and hydrogen sulfide.
Methane. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so
which that stinks too, right? Methane.
What does a freaking campfire smell like? Carbon.
Yeah.
Right, and then you add sulfur on top of it. Like, that's one of the reasons when it comes out of Bible, they says the lake of fire that cannot be quenched. It smells like fire and brimstone. That's carbon and sulfur. Like that's what you're smelling. Rotten eggs and
exactly.
And dead. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
and this association isn't modern.
Things,
it's very old.
And on top of everything that you just said, one of the strongest human emotions, and it doesn't get a lot because we're such a comfort society now, but it's one of the things that kept human beings alive for, basically all the way up until the early 20th century, was the sense of disgust. Disgust is a natural human emotion that is triggered almost exclusively. Well, it can be triggered by the eyes. You see maggots and vomit or something, but it's really mostly triggered by, have you ever seen people in a hospital and they look at something and they're like, oh, don't do that, and then they start retching?
Oh yeah.
That is basic human disgust. And you've seen it as a cop, and I've seen it. One of the tricks in the hospital is to rub some, there's some essential oils that you'll put inside of your mask, right? So that you can only smell toothpaste, right? Mint is a big one because mint covers your stomach and everything. But the whole point there is to keep your sense of disgust at bay. And these old peasants, to your point, if they were to smell something that smells like death and carbon and sulfur, they all smell like death because they smell like decomposing flesh. That's going to activate your sense of disgust as a human being, and then senses of dread and visions of death and all that stuff come with it, and you're like, I don't want to get anywhere near that. It all just makes sense if you think about it through the context of a human being that doesn't have any, it's like, I've never read about that, I've never seen a video about that, or I didn't watch Eyewitness as a kid. Dun, 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 dun. I don't know what I'm looking at.
Right.
But all of that tracks. It all tracks.
Well, it's just, I think, and this is kind of buttoning up everything that we've talked about, but you can sit here and say,
I have one more thing that I want to talk about when you're done, but
yeah. Well, no, I was just going to say that there is some scientific evidence at play here that you can say could be causing this sorts of experiences that people are having, right? And then there are all of these overtones of paganism and Christianity and the things that people attribute to sites like this, right? If you are a 13th century Christian and this is a pagan site this is a part of the oral tradition of your area for the past 500 years, right? Of course, you're going to have some fear, and you're going to have these emotions about this area, and then your confirmation bias is going to be that's an area, right? And if you're a duke in this area and you're trying to garner the trust of people, and this is a genuine concern of these people, what are you going to do? You're going to find a way to assuage them, right? And perhaps that just means that you're now saying okay, the Christianity has now triumphed over the pagan evil in this area, because now there is a Christian Christian monument built atop of this, and I have taken the extra steps of facing certain fortifications on the inside at this hole so that we can put men there and protect everybody. And you can check a box saying you've done this, right? And then there's the prevailing theme of just like I said, the triumph of Christianity over paganism. And that you can see is one religion supplants the other all the way through history. Doesn't matter what it is.
Literally put St. Michael on the wall.
They put St. Michael, exactly.
Yeah.
You know, and that's seen throughout all of Europe, is these pagan sites, and they're being overtaken by Christian sites and churches and monuments and all this Christian iconography to now, so to ward off the pagan evil and to replace it with the Christian good. And perhaps that is a reason why this legend of Castle Houska has existed for so long, as this sort of trope of the Christianity triumph over the paganism of the area. And that is why these legends and the castle itself were built. And that, to me, I feel like is probably the biggest answer to the why this all is the way it is this sort of prevailing overtone of religion. But there is the scientific aspect of it too, with the foul smells and the EMF potentially there with the limestone, that people are experiencing something, but back in the day, unaware that this is a natural process you're going through because you're being exposed to electromagnetic field and perhaps methane or hydrogen sulfide.
Yeah, I think a big part of it too is that humanity cries out for God. Humanity cries out to understand the eternal. And as we move forward and we look back into our past, not to get too esoteric on it.
I mean, why not? This is a whole episode.
I guess. But I do think that there's a portion of it that we see it kind of like we talked about the pyramids, kind of like we talked about Stonehenge, kind of like we talk about, the hill of Golgotha where Jesus was crucified. We look at these places, and again, humans made in the image of God, we desire the eternal, and we desire to know what's on the other side. And these places to us represent, there's something there that we can't explain, but we know for a fact it exists because look at it, it's built there. And so I think that there's a part of us, for as much as we want to know, that human beings don't ever want to find out, because it keeps all of that alive.
Don't ask questions you don't want answers to.
Yeah. So I wanted to finish up with there's a couple of the ghost stories from Houska that we didn't tell.
No.
So the one that so two that freaked me out the most is there's supposedly a headless horseman that roams the valley, and there's a horse that's running around that's decapitated and gushing blood, and a headless rider that's chasing it, but he's also headless, and he's chasing the horse, and he never can catch it. And so I find that to be a very interesting story. Why are they both headless, and why are they eternally apart from each other, and he's chasing his horse? So that's an interesting apparition that's seen. And then my absolute, people are going to make fun of me in the chat, but I'll just go ahead and tell it. I fucking hate the woman in white. I hate that legend so much.
So commonplace.
But this might be one of the earliest women in white in European history, because supposedly there's a woman in white that roams the third story of the castle.
Yeah,
that many people have seen, and she roams the third story, and she's singing, and that is so fucking creepy.
It is creepy.
And then there's another story of a caretaker of the castle, and this goes back into the early 19th century, where he said he was, I think he was working downstairs, and he heard voices coming from the chapel. So this is after the point that the chapel was built. And so he made his way upstairs because he thought he heard people that had entered the castle that weren't supposed to be there. And when he entered the chapel, he heard voices that were talking to each other from the walls of the chapel. and they were speaking in a language that he didn't understand as a Czech, and he immediately got freaked out. He left. He quit his job, never would go back to the castle, and when they asked him what he heard, the only word that he was able to decipher is he said they kept saying seraph to each other.
An angel?
Right. Well, in the original, in the Bible, in the Old Testament, there's what's called seraphim. So you've heard of seraphim and cherubim?
Cherubim, yep.
Cherubim are like the little baby angels that people see. Seraphim
the famous Raphael painting.
Mm-hmm. Seraphim are the angels that surround God's throne and do nothing but sing praises to God. Like that's their entire job, is to be a heavenly choir, and they sing praises to God for all eternity. So that's another story that comes out of the chapel or out of that castle that seems to go on through all of these years. So there's one other thing after the final ghost stories, and I don't know if we're allowed to even talk about this on Rumble. So I'm just going to hit it and then glance off and see what you think, because I know for a fact we can't talk about this on YouTube.
Oh.
But a lot of the pagan iconography that we see from groups that we've talked about, the Nazis and the original pagans, and especially coming out of this area of, the witches, the wizards in the woods, the burning of effigies, some of the different ceremonies that they had. There's
just like child abuse sort of thing?
No. There's conspiracy theories from places in the United States where this kind of stuff still happens yearly.
Oh, yeah.
Where heads, where heads of state.
Bohemian Grove?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
where
it's like
heads of state.
A few hours from me right now.
Still gather. Oh, and the other thing that I forgot to mention earlier when we were talking about the limestone is if you look at like Mount Rainier and Mount Shasta and places like that, where all of the stuff, paranormal stuff happens in the United States, disappearances and David Paulides and all that, massive amounts of limestone.
Yeah,
that still happens there. But getting back to the Bohemian Grove, like there is a documented group of people, like heads of state, like your Zucks,
Alex Jones's famous video.
Yeah, and he's been there, and they see
we talked about this quite a bit on the podcast.
In the woods. Okay, well, I was just gonna hit it.
I was just saying, you have full reign.
Where they gather in the woods, and they still perform some of these ancient rituals.
Supposedly to Moloch.
Supposedly, where they burn things in effigy, and they have like certain houses that they separate off into, and several of our presidents have been there, to include Ronald Reagan, which people don't like to admit to. And it's like this stuff still happens, and there still are secret societies in the world to this day, especially here in the United States, where it's like a lot of the pagan rituals and things that we talked about from earlier, they still, like, it still carries forward. And some of the, for all of us peons that sit down here, and you may think I'm absolutely nuts, I challenge you to go out and look it up. A lot of us peons that sit around, we go, oh, conspiracy theory, oh, bunk, oh, that's fucking ghost stories. Well, apparently in the 1940s, people like Rudolf Hess and Heinrich Himmler thought it was worth enough to travel halfway across the world to inhabit a castle that nobody cared about.
To prop up their entire kingdom.
To prop up their entire Reich. And then to this day, some of the wealthiest people in the United States gather in forests in the United States to practice some of the very same rituals. So you tell me there's nothing to it, and I will tell you that shit still happens. And that's all I wanted to say about everything that we talked about tonight, because there's a certain difference between the wealthy class and the the middle to lower class, where it's like, what is the difference between us? Maybe the difference is not the hidden knowledge like we talked about, not the Gnosticism, but maybe the difference is some of the knowledge that should be available to man is kept from you.
For your own safety.
Maybe, could be, I don't know.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to throw that shit out there on the end, just for maybe come back later. Maybe we'll do a whole episode about the Bohemian Grove.
Yeah, we very well could. If you drove down or flew down here, maybe we could bring some of our boomsticks with us and go take a trip just for personal safety. Just saying.
I would do it, dude.
Yeah, I would too.
Don't tempt me with a good time, Mama.
Yeah, no, I would. I really, really would. Just go on a camping trip. But I think that's a great way to wrap it up, man. And I'm just going to say I appreciate everybody listening for almost 3 hours on this stuff. And there's a lot of information, dude. You would think like talking about a castle would invoke all of these thoughts on, religion and paganism and, the occult and all these different tropes throughout history and all these different topics that we touched on, is super interesting what seemingly one little thing can spin off into, Who did Slavibor think back in the 9th century that two dudes would be sitting on something called a computer talking about this on a podcast? Absolutely not. But here we are. Right, pretty interesting. But I just want to shout out real fast to some of our sponsors, which you can find the links to in our show notes. First and foremost, we appreciate Killcliff Energy for sponsoring us. I survived on Killcliff when I was in Germany. The long shifts as a military police officer, good clean energy. I love Killcliff. Great flavors. Chris is showing one that he doesn't want to show all the way. But the Joe Rogan flavor, the spicy pineapple, I thought was really, really good. And but all the flavors that they have are really good. I enjoy Killcliff. You can get 20% off with KC Podcast 20. And a big shout out to Protect. That's PROTEKT, where is a hydration and sleep liquid. I love it. The hydration stuff is actually bomb. I have used both Liquid IV and Protect, and I actually prefer Protect now.
Can I tell a funny story about Protect?
Yeah, go for it.
So when I got home, I had the
boxes
product sample that they sent us, and I got them mixed up, and I woke up.
Oh, did you take a sleep?
And I took 2 sleeps because I thought that they were. I thought that they were hydration.
Dang, it's like you're trying to lift like.
I woke up at noon. No, I took them and I was like, oh, it was like 4:00 in the morning, and I'm like, I'm gonna get up in the gym for like an hour. Let me slam some hydration. And so I did. I woke up at noon. I was like,
no, actually, the sleep stuff works really well. I'll tell you that. Yeah. I use it and I enjoy it very well. But yeah, you can use I Came With Fire for 15% off of that. Like all these links in the show notes. But yeah, huge shout out, Killcliff, Protect. And then we've got Redefine Violence, which you can go get some awesome MMA gear and clothing. The Light Sleeper, which is an awesome little camping tent, man. That thing is epic. Chris has tested it out before. And then we've got Skull.
I'm using their
we'll use them when we go to Bohemian Grove.
Hey, I'm also using their camping pillow downrange right now, and there you
go.
Awesome. I put it in my rucksack.
Yep.
It's great gear.
Yep. And the Skull and Crossbeans coffee. All of these are veteran-owned businesses, guys. And literally one of the best ways to support us is to support our sponsors by going and picking up some product. Everybody I know either drinks coffee or energy drinks. And everybody, because you drink coffee and energy drinks, is definitely dehydrated. So go and get some Killcliff and some Protect and cancel those motherfuckers out and keep it going. You know what I'm saying? But yeah, no, we appreciate the heck out of our sponsors, and thank you guys so much for listening. We're going to get the heck out of here, and we'll catch you guys on the next episode.